Garrick Vane leaned over the auction rail, close enough that Tamsin could smell the Copenhagen tucked into his lip, and said it loud enough for 3 rows of men to hear, "Somebody ought to put those animals down and save the girl the embarrassment." Laughter crackled through the crowd like dry kindling catching fire. 19 bison stood in the pen below rib cages, showing through dull coats, heads hanging, hooves crusted with old mud. The auctioneer had already apologized twice for wasting everyone's time. And there was Tamsin Rourke, 22 years old, standing at the rail with a bidding number in her thick-knuckled hand, every man in Briar Hollow waiting to see her walk away. She didn't walk away. She raised that number and bought every last one of them. If that had been you, standing there, the whole county watching, the most powerful man in the room already writing your obituary out loud, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if this is your first time on this channel, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss a story. We drop new ones every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next in Tamsin's story. Hit the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning Tamsin Rourke drove to the Briar Hollow livestock auction, she had exactly $4,217 in her checking account. She knew the number by heart because she had counted it 3 times the night before while sitting at her grandfather's kitchen table, reading his notebooks by a lamp that buzzed when the wind hit the north wall. She hadn't slept well. Hadn't slept well in 3 months. Not since Orson Rourke died quietly in the county hospital with his boots still on. Refusing the soft slippers a nurse tried to slide onto his feet. The ranch had passed to her, not to any of the cousins who showed up at the funeral with concerned expressions and quiet questions about acreage values. To her, a 22-year-old woman who'd spent more of her childhood at Windscar than anywhere else, who knew which fence posts leaned and which windmill squealed and which ridgeline turned gold exactly 40 minutes before sunset in October. She also knew, because the county had made sure she knew, that Windscar Ranch was considered nearly worthless. 4,000 acres of dry native prairie with no irrigation, poor water access, and grass so coarse the neighboring ranchers' cattle refused to graze it properly. The creek that cut through the eastern section ran maybe 4 months a year. The house needed a new roof on the east wing. The barn had a lean in it that made Tamsin's great-aunt Nell say, every single time she walked past it, "That thing's gonna sneeze and fall over." Nell was 79 years old and wrong about almost nothing. The estate attorney had been gentle but honest. He'd said, "Miss Rourke, you have inherited a property with significant challenges. There are interested buyers if you'd like to explore." She'd thanked him and left his office before he finished the sentence. What nobody knew, what Tamsin hadn't told a single person yet, was that she'd spent the politics reading every notebook Orson had filled over 40 years. 43 notebooks. Composition books with cardboard covers, spiral notebooks from the feed store in town, one stretch of years recorded in a hardback journal her grandmother had given him that he'd filled from front to back, and then sideways in the margins when he ran out of room. Orson Rourke had been watching this prairie his whole life. Watching what cattle did to it, watching what happened when the land rested, watching the old growth come back on sections nobody grazed for a season and die again when the cattle returned too soon. He'd tracked it in rainfall records and grass height measurements and rough hand-drawn maps that showed which sections recovered and which ones just kept going thinner. And somewhere in the middle of Notebook 26, written in handwriting that had gotten shakier but no less certain, Tamsin found the sentence that changed everything. The land isn't useless. It has simply been fed by the wrong animal. She'd read it twice. Then she'd sat very still for a long time, because she understood exactly what he meant. And because understanding it meant she was about to do something that would make the entire county of Briar Hollow think she had lost her mind. The auction lot smelled the way they all smelled manure and diesel and the particular anxiety of animals in unfamiliar pens. Tamsin arrived early, before most of the ranchers, and walked the perimeter of the holding area, looking at what was being sold. She found them in the last pen on the left, the one farthest from the main floor and closest to the drainage ditch. 19 bison, a bull, several cows, some younger animals. All of them thin in a way that made your throat tighten. Their winter coats were coming in patchy. The youngest one stood apart from the others, with its head low in a way that wasn't sleepy. It was the posture of an animal that had stopped expecting things to improve. She stood at that pen rail for a long time. A man from the auction office came up beside her eventually and said, "Apologetically, ma'am, I'll be honest. Those came off a failed operation over in Cutter County. Previous owner couldn't feed them through last summer. We're not expecting much interest. You're welcome to look. But what's the reserve?" he told her. She did the math in her head. If she spent what it would cost to buy all 19, she'd have enough left for maybe 6 weeks of operating costs. No cushion, no emergency fund, no margin for a broken pump, or a sick animal, or a late payment from anywhere. She said okay, and walked inside to get her bidding number. That was when Garrick Vane arrived. Garrick Vane was 64 years old and had been the most consequential rancher in Briar Hollow for the better part of 30 years. He ran 1,800 head of commercial cattle across several properties, employed 11 men full-time, and had personally served on the county agricultural board for 2 decades. He was not a cruel man. Exactly. He was the kind of man who had been right about enough things for long enough that he'd stop seriously considering the possibility of being wrong. When Garrick Vane gave an opinion, it landed in a room like a stone, dropped on a wood floor. Everybody heard it, and nobody rushed to pick it up. He didn't know Tamsin well. He'd known Orson well enough, had respected the old man's knowledge even when Orson's ideas got eccentric in his later years, had sent a wreath to the funeral. He looked at Tamsin the way a lot of people in Briar Hollow looked at her quickly and with a kind of automatic discounting that she had long since stopped being surprised by. She was young. She was a woman. She was heavyset in a county that associated physical size with softness and lack of discipline. She had no experience running a ranch independently. She had just inherited a property that several experienced men had already decided wasn't worth the property taxes. Garrick took one look at the Bison pen, then one look at Tamsin standing beside it, and drew a conclusion so fast it barely qualified as thinking. He leaned over the rail and made his comment. The laughter that followed wasn't vicious. That almost made it worse. It was the comfortable laughter of men who weren't even being unkind on purpose. They were just agreeing with something that seemed obvious. The way you laugh when someone says, "It looks like rain," and it already is raining. Nobody looked at Tamsin to check her face. Nobody except a teenager leaning against the far fence post with a beat-up notebook open in his hands, watching everything. His name was Eli Mercer. He was 15 and lived on the property adjacent to Windscar Ranch's north boundary. He had been interested in bison since finding a photograph in a library book 2 years ago and had been quietly researching them ever since, filling that notebook with information he'd collected from agricultural bulletins and library books, and one very long internet rabbit hole about native prairie restoration. He hadn't told anyone about this interest because, in Briar Hollow, admitting you found bison more interesting than cattle was approximately as socially practical as announcing you'd decided to become a ballet dancer. Eli watched Tamsin's face when Garrick made his comment. She didn't flinch. She didn't redden. She looked at the pen of thin, sorry-looking bison for another moment, then turned and walked toward the bidding floor with her number in her hand. Eli closed his notebook and followed her. The bidding on the bison lot lasted less than 4 minutes. 2 other buyers had entered token bids low offers meant to test the water, not win anything. The auctioneer sounded relieved when the numbers started moving at all. Tamsin raised her number twice and watched the other bidders drop out without much resistance. Nobody in that room wanted 19 starving bison badly enough to fight for them. When the gavel came down, she felt a physical sensation she would later describe to Nell as the moment a door locks behind you. Not panic, not quite, something more clarifying than that. The feeling of a decision made so completely that your body accepts it before your mind finishes processing. She stood at the payment window, counting out money she didn't have extra of, and Eli Mercer appeared at her elbow. "You bought them," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like he was confirming something he'd half expected. "I bought them. All 19. All 19. He was quiet for a moment. "Then they're going to say you're crazy." "They already are," Tamsin said. She signed the paperwork. "You know anything about bison?" He held up the notebook. She glanced at it. The cover had Bison drawn on it in ballpoint pen, surrounded by what appeared to be grass species labels. She looked at the kid for a moment, the seriousness in his face, the careful way he was holding the notebook like it meant something, and made a decision about him. The same quick way she'd made decisions her whole life. "You want to help me get them to Windscar?" she asked. He said yes before the sentence finished. What followed was 3 hours of chaos that Tamsin would later describe, charitably, as educational. Bison are not cattle. This is a fact that sounds obvious when you say it out loud, and turns out to be completely inadequate preparation for the experience of trying to load 19 of them onto a trailer that they did not want to be on. The animals moved when they felt like it, stopped when they felt like it, and expressed displeasure with options they found unsatisfactory in ways that were immediate and physical and did not take human preferences into account. The bull Tamsin had already started thinking of him as the bull, as though there were only one bull in the world, which was how he seemed to regard himself, walked calmly up the loading ramp, stopped exactly halfway, and stood there for 22 minutes while everyone involved reassessed their life choices. Eli turned out to be useful in a way Tamsin hadn't expected. He was quiet. He moved slowly. He read the animal's body language with a patience that most adults didn't have, and that the auction hands, who were used to cattle and increasingly irritated, had entirely run out of. When the bull finally decided to walk the rest of the way onto the trailer, it was because Eli had been standing at the far end of it, perfectly still, for 15 minutes, and something about his stillness seemed to satisfy whatever question the bull had been considering. "How'd you know to do that?" Tamsin asked. Eli shrugged. "I read if its windows were dark. I read that they don't like being pushed. They'll go where they want to go. You just have to make sure where you want them to go, but looks like their idea." Tamsin filed that away. It would turn out to be true about Bison, and also, she would eventually realize, about most of the other difficult things she'd have to manage over the following years. She got the herd to Windscar at dusk. Nell was waiting at the gate. Most of its windows were dark. Nell Rourke was 79 years old with a face that had been weathered into something that looked carved rather than aged, and she had a way of standing with her arms crossed that communicated, without words, exactly what she thought of whatever she was looking at. She watched Tamsin back the trailer up to the pasture gate. She watched the first bison come down the ramp unsteady, blinking, finding its footing on new ground. She watched the others follow, slow and careful, spreading out into the near pasture and immediately beginning to graze. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have been insufferably pleased with himself right now." Tamsin laughed. It surprised her. The laugh came up fast, almost sharp, the way laughter does when relief and anxiety are competing for the same space. "He would have. Those are very thin animals, Tamsin. I know, you spent most of what you had. I know that, too." Nell unfolded her arms, looked at the bison moving in the last light. One of the younger animals had found a patch of the ridge grass, the coarse, deep-rooted native bluestem that cattle consistently refused, and was working through it steadily, head down, moving with a focus that didn't look like desperation anymore. "Orson said the cattle wouldn't touch that grass," Nell said. "Not to anyone in particular." "They don't," Tamsin said. "These will." Nell was quiet again, then, "Well, I suppose we'll find out." She turned and walked back toward the house. At the door she stopped and said, without turning around, "The north fence on Section 3 has a post that's been leaning since July. If those animals find it before you fix it, they'll go through it like it's not there." Then she went inside. Eli was still standing at the pasture fence, watching the herd. He had his notebook open, but wasn't writing in it, just watching. Tamsin stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. Prairie went gray, and then dark around the shapes of 19 animals that everyone in Briar Hollow had already decided were worthless, moving slowly through grass that everyone in Briar Hollow had already decided was useless. She thought about Garrick Vane's voice at the auction, comfortable certainty of it, the way the laughter had followed so easily. She thought about her grandfather's handwriting, getting shakier in the later notebooks but never less precise. The land isn't useless. It has simply been fed by the wrong animal. She had $4,217 at the beginning of the day. She had $63 and some change now. She had 19 starving bison on land everyone had written off, a leaning fence post she had to fix before morning, a 15-year-old neighbor who read agricultural bulletins for fun, and an elderly great-aunt who expressed affection by telling you what was about to go wrong. And she had the absolute bone-level certainty that her grandfather had been right. $53. 19 animals. 4,000 acres. The county could laugh all it wanted. She had work to do. The north fence post fell over on the third night. Tamsin had fixed it the morning after she brought the herd home, driven a new post 2 feet deep, packed the dirt around it with her boot heel, tested it with both hands. It held. She'd moved on to 17 other things that needed doing and told herself the fence was handled. It wasn't handled. What she hadn't accounted for was the bull's curiosity. Spent the first 2 days investigating the perimeter of his new pasture the way a man walks through a house he's just been handed the keys to methodically, without hurry, pressing on things to see what gave. He found the North Section 3 post on Tuesday evening and leaned against it the way Nell had predicted, not aggressively, just with the full, unhurried weight of an animal that goes 900 pounds, even when it's underfed, and the post went over like it had been waiting for permission. Tamsin got the call from Eli at 5:40 in the morning. 3 of them are on the road, he said. He sounded out of breath. I saw them when I went to check the horses. 2 cows and the young one that's been limping. She was already pulling her boots on. Are they moving? Cows are grazing the ditch. The young one's standing in the middle of the road, just standing there. Don't chase them, she said. Don't make any sudden movements. I'm coming. She grabbed her jacket and her grandfather's long canvas coat that hung by the door because the mornings had gone cold, and she drove the half-mile to the north boundary in the dark, with her hazard lights on. The young Bison, she'd started thinking of him as the limper, not a real name, just a marker, was exactly where Eli said he was. Standing in the center of the county road in the headlights of her truck with an expression that suggested he found the situation reasonable. Getting them back took an hour and 20 minutes. The trick, Eli had already learned, was to be less interesting than the direction you wanted them to go. You couldn't herd bison the way you herded cattle. Every instinct that worked with cattle movement, noise, pressure made bison do the opposite of what you needed. So they moved slowly, positioned themselves at angles, and essentially made the open pasture gate look like the most appealing option available. The cows went through eventually. The limper stood in the road for another 9 minutes, turned once to look at Tamsin with the pure, flat assessment of an animal that owes you nothing, and then walked through the gate at his own speed. Tamsin fixed the fence with better posts and set a second line of wire while Eli held a flashlight in the gray early light. Neither of them said much. They were too tired, and the work required attention. When it was done, Eli sat on the tailgate of her truck and drank the coffee she'd brought in a thermos and said, "That's going to keep happening, you know. Fence issue. They're not really fence animals. I know. Their whole biology is built around moving. They followed the grass across the whole continent for thousands of years. Fencing them is..." He paused, searching for the word. "Unnatural," Tamsin said. I was going to say counterproductive. But yeah. She looked at him. He was 15 and talking about bison biology at 6 in the morning after spending an hour and a half moving animals off a county road, and he said it the way some kids talked about video games or sports, with that particular energy of a person who has found the thing their brain was designed to care about. "Then I won't fight the fence so much," she said. "I'll work with how they move. Rotate the sections. Keep them moving the way they want to move, just directed." Eli'd his coffee cup and looked at her with the expression of someone who had just watched a person arrive at a conclusion they'd been thinking about for 2 years. "That's actually what the research says," he said carefully, like he wasn't sure if she'd take it as an insult. "Tell me." So he did. He came back that afternoon with 3 agricultural bulletins he'd printed at the school library and a hand-drawn map of Windscar Ranch that he'd made from memory, which was detailed enough that Tamsin initially thought Orson must have left it somewhere. Eli spread everything on the kitchen table and walked her through what he'd been reading for 2 years: rotational grazing, native prairie recovery, particular relationship between large migratory grazers and deep-rooted grass systems that had evolved together over centuries. Most of its windows were dark. Nell sat in the corner chair and listened with her eyes half closed, which was how she listened when she was paying close attention. The way cattle graze, Eli said, Pointing at a section on one of the bulletins, they eat what they like and avoid what they don't. And they'll overgraze the good stuff until it's gone, and then the plant community shifts. You end up with less native diversity, shallower roots. But Bison, he tapped his hand-drawn map. They kept moving. And the grasses evolved with that. The native stuff, the deep-rooted blue stem and switchgrass, and the rest, it needs that pressure and that rest cycle. It needs something to graze it hard and then leave for a season. Tamsin was looking at the map. She pulled one of Orson's notebooks from the stack she'd brought to the kitchen and opened it to a page near the back. The hand-drawn map Orson had made 40 years old. The lines faded, and some of the ink smeared was not identical to Eli's. But it divided the ranch into sections almost the same way. And the notes around the sections tracked grass recovery in language that was older and less technical than Eli's bulletins, but was describing exactly the same thing. She put the two maps side by side on the table. Eli stared at them. He already knew, he said. He already knew, Tamsin said. Most of it's no the dark. Nell opened her eyes all the way. She looked out the window toward the pasture where 19 bison were grazing a section of ridgegrass that cattle had avoided for decades. She didn't say anything, but she unfolded her hands from her lap and laid them flat on her knees, which was, for Nell Rourke, approximately equivalent to someone else standing up and cheering. Plan they built over the following week was not clean or fully formed. It was more like a framework held together, partly by Eli's research, and partly by Orson's notes, and partly by what Tamsin was observing directly, which sometimes matched Riche and sometimes didn't, and always required her to make a judgment. Call with insufficient information and insufficient money, and no safety net worth mentioning. She divided Windscar into 7 grazing sections, based on the maps, the existing fence lines, and the water sources she could actually access. The sections weren't equal in size or quality. 2 of them were the difficult ridge sections where the coarse native grasses grew, the ones cattle had always refused. The rest ranged from decent native pasture to 3 sections that had been overgrazed under Orson's last few years, when he'd rented to a neighbor with too many cattle and not enough ground. The overgrazed sections worried her most. The soil in places was nearly bare, the remaining grass thin and weedy, the kind of pasture that looked like it had given up. She'd walked those sections on her first full week at Windscar and come back to the house in a worse mood than she'd gone out in. Nels had said, without looking up from what she was doing, Orson let those sections go. He knew it, and it bothered him. How long did it take him to figure out he'd made a mistake? About a season too long. That's how it usually goes. Tamsin put the bison on the best sections first, the ridge pastures, the grasses they'd been bred for and wanted. She moved them before they'd grazed a section more than 2/3 down, which required watching closely because bison, she learned fast, were not cooperative about being moved if they weren't ready. The trick was timing. Move them slightly before the grass needed a rest, not after. Anticipate rather than react. She got it wrong twice in the first month. The first time she moved them too early and they broke through the temporary barrier. She'd set not because they were panicking, but because they'd found better grass on the other side and had simply decided to go get it. It took most of a Sichuan, and afterward, Tamsin sat on the ground with her back against a fence of a post and ate the sandwich she'd packed for lunch while staring at the gap in the wire with a feeling she didn't have precise words for. Eli, who had come straight from school and still had his backpack on, sat down beside her and said nothing for a while. Eventually, he said, "You moved them because you were nervous. The grass was getting too short." "Yes, but it wasn't actually too short yet." "No. So you moved them before the grass needed it, and they could tell the grass on this side was still better. So Semsa..." "Eli, yeah, I know what I did." Pause. "You want half this sandwich?" she asked. "Yes, please." The second mistake was the opposite. She waited too long on section 4, got distracted by a broken windmill and a tense phone conversation with the county tax office about the timeline for her first payment, and by the time she moved the herd, the native forbs in section 4 were grazed closer than she wanted. The grass came back. Eventually, it took 3 weeks longer to recover than the other sections, which set her rotation back and caused a cascade of small problems she spent the better part of 2 weeks managing. But it came back. That was the thing she kept returning to. The grass came back. Not everywhere. Not on the worst of the overgrazed sections, not yet. But where the bison moved through and left, and she gave the land the rest it needed, the response was visible. Slow, uneven. Not the dramatic green flush she'd half imagined, but real. The coarse ridge grass she'd worried about the stuff everyone said was useless. The bison worked through it steadily, and behind them, in the weeks after they left, she found seedlings of species she hadn't seen in the sections before. Native plants regrowing from roots that had been waiting, it seemed, for exactly this. She was in the East Ridge section alone on a Tuesday afternoon, crouched down looking at a cluster of seedlings she'd identified from Orson's botanical sketches in Notebook 12, when she heard a truck slow on the county road and stop. She didn't look up right away. The window came down and she heard, "That's Bison grazing in there." She stood up. It was Dale Pruitt, who ran about 400 cattle a few miles north. He was leaning out his truck window, squinting at the ridge. "It is," Tamsin said. He looked at her. He wasn't hostile. Exactly, Dale wasn't a hostile man, but he had the expression of someone trying to categorize something that didn't fit the categories he was used to. "Orson's granddaughter," he said. "That's right. What are you doing with bison on this section? Cattle won't hardly touch that grass. Bison will." He chewed on that for a moment. "What's your plan, if you don't mind?" She told him the simplified version, the rotation, the recovery periods, the native grass restoration. She watched his face while she talked. He wasn't dismissive the way some of the men at the auction had been. He was listening in the way that people listen when they're not sure what they're hearing, but they haven't decided it's wrong yet. When she finished, he said, "Your grandfather used to talk about something like this. Nobody paid him much mind." "I know." Dale looked at the ridge for another moment. "Well," he said. Then he rolled his window up and drove on. It wasn't encouragement. It wasn't criticism either. Tamsin went back to looking at her seedlings and decided to count it as neutral, which, at this point in the project, felt like progress. Money got tight in October in a way that stopped being abstract and started being physical, the specific anxiety of checking the account balance and doing the math and coming up short by amounts that weren't enormous but had nowhere to come from. She'd sold the 2 pieces of equipment she didn't need. She'd cut every expense she could identify. Nell contributed what she called her rainy day money, presenting it at breakfast one morning in an envelope with no ceremony whatsoever, saying only, "Don't waste it on something stupid," which was the most affectionate thing Nell knew how to say. Tamsin sat with the envelope in her hands and said, "Nell, I can't." "You can and you will," Nell said. "Orson would have spent it the same way, and you know it. Don't make a speech about it." She didn't make a speech. She deposited the money and used it to cover the water pump repair in Section 2 and 3 weeks of basic feed supplement for the youngest animals, who were still underweight enough that she didn't trust them through a hard winter without some backup. The first real winter storm hit in early November. Not the worst storm the county had seen, but cold enough and long enough 4 days of temperatures that dropped below zero at night, with wind that came off the open prairie and hit windscar with nothing to stop it. Tamsin spent those 4 days doing the kind of work that doesn't photograph well and isn't interesting to describe and is absolutely essential, checking water lines, breaking ice, monitoring the herd's condition, sleeping in short stretches, going out again. She'd been warned, obliquely, by almost everyone who knew she had bison, that winter would be the thing that ended the experiment. Bison couldn't handle a hard winter without serious feed supplementation. She'd need hay, and hay was expensive, and the math didn't work. What actually happened was different. The bison moved to the ridge sections during the worst of the cold, not because she directed them there, but because they chose it, moving with a group intelligence she found both impressive and slightly unnerving. The ridges caught less drifting snow. The coarse native grasses stood above the snowpack where pasture grass was buried. She watched the bullpaw through the snow with his enormous head, clearing access to grass underneath, and the cows and younger animals following behind and grazing what he exposed. They were not comfortable. She wasn't going to romanticize it. The young animals, especially the limper, had hard days. She did supplement the youngest ones, as planned. But the herd as a whole moved through the storm with a self-sufficiency that made her neighboring ranchers' winter feeding operations look, by comparison, like a system that had been designed around the wrong animal to begin with. which was exactly what Orson had written 30 years before in Notebook 19. By the time the storm broke and the temperature came back up, Tamsin had run the numbers 3 times. She had used a fraction of the hay she'd budgeted for. The bison had eaten it, mostly the native ridgegrass, mostly by their own foraging, with her supplement as backup rather than primary feed. She called Eli when she had the numbers solid. They made it, she said. Paws on his end. All of them? All 19. And the limper is walking better. I think the cold actually helped lessen inflammation, maybe. Eli was quiet for a moment in a way that meant he was either writing something down or trying not to sound as excited as he actually was. How much hay did you end up using? She told him. Another pause. That's less than a quarter of what? I know. I know, Eli. She could hear him breathing. Then Miss Rourke. I think your grandfather was right. She was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the pasture where the herd was moving slowly in the thin winter light, their breath showing in the cold air. The bull was out front. The younger animals clustered in the middle. The limper, who was limping less, brought up the rear with the patient unhurry of an animal that had decided it would get there when it got there. He was right, she said. Now we have to keep proving it. The first real confrontation with Garrick Vane came in late January. She hadn't sought it. Garrick had come to Dale Pruitt's place for a meeting of some kind, the County Ag Board planning session, she found out later, and had driven past Windscar on his way back. She was at the east boundary fence doing a routine check when she heard his truck. He didn't stop. He slowed, looked at the herd, looked at her, and then kept driving. But 2 days later she got a call from a county extension officer named Hollis, who was professional and careful and made it very clear he was not doing anything official, just reaching out. There have been some concerns raised, Hollis said, about the Bison operation. Specifically about what? Perimeter security, whether the fencing meets county standards for non-domestic livestock. Tamsin was quiet for a moment. Who raised the concerns? Hollis was professionally silent. I see, Tamsin said. Send me the standards. I'll have everything documented by end of week. She spent 2 days going over every fence line with a tape measure and a camera and a printed copy of the county standards she'd found online. She documented everything. She found 3 sections that needed minor upgrades, fixed them herself over the course of those 2 days, and submitted a written record of the inspection and corrections to the county extension office by Friday. Hollis called Monday to say everything looked fine. Thanked him. She hung up. She went out to Section 5, where the bison had been for 2 weeks, and she sat on a flat rock at the edge of the pasture and watched them and let herself be angry. For exactly 15 minutes, most of its windows were dark, which was the amount of time she'd decided anger was allowed, before it started costing her something she couldn't afford to spend. Then she went back to work. Nell heard about it that evening, not from Tamsin, who hadn't planned to mention it, but from someone Nell called on the phone from time to time, who appeared to have their finger on the pulse of every development in Briar Hollow, simultaneously. Nell set her coffee cup down with a click that something. Garrick Vane, she said. Not a question. I don't know for certain, Tamsin said. Nell's expression communicated what she thought of that distinction. He's feeling it. Feeling what? The fact that you're still here. He expected you to be gone by October. You're here in January, and your animals made it through the cold, and the county road hasn't seen a loose bison in 6 weeks. She picked her coffee cup back up. Men like Garrick don't come after you when they think you're failing. They come after you when they start to worry you might not. Tamsin thought about that. That's a strange kind of compliment, she said. It's not a compliment, Nell said. It's a warning. There's a difference. February brought the first calves. Not all of them. 2 cows were visibly pregnant, and both went to term without incident, which Tamsin had not allowed herself to assume would happen, and therefore experienced with a relief that surprised her in its intensity. She'd prepared as well as she could researched bison birthing, had the vet's number ready, watched the cows closely in their last weeks. In the end, neither birth required intervention. Bison, it turned out, had been managing this particular process without human assistance for considerably longer than Briar Hollow had existed, and both calves arrived in the early morning cold and were on their feet within the hour. Eli was there for the second one. He'd started spending more time at Windscar on weekends, partly to learn and partly because Tamsin suspected Though she never said so, whatever was happening at his own family's place was something he needed distance from. She didn't ask, she just made sure there was food when he showed up and gave him work that was real work and not busy work, and let the ranch be whatever the ranch needed to be for him. He stood at the fence watching the newborn find its footing with the expression of a person witnessing something that confirms something they've believed for a long time. 2 calves, he said quietly. 2 calves, she agreed. From 19 animals that everyone thought would die before winter. They didn't die before winter. Eli looked at her sidelong. No, they didn't. He paused. Word's going to get around, you know. About the calves. About the winter. I know. Some people are going to be curious. Maybe some of them will be... He hesitated. Friendly about it, Tamsin said. I was going to say less hostile. She almost smiled. That would be something. The word did get around. The way everything got around in Briar Hollow, not through any announcement or intention, but through the simple physics of a small county where people talked. The calves were a fact. The winter survival was a fact. The fence complaint had gone nowhere, and everyone who tracked county business knew it. And the grass on Windscar's ridge sections, visible from the county road on the east side, was doing something in late February that most pastures in Briar Hollow were not doing. It was showing the faint, unmistakable color of early growth. Not green exactly. Not yet. But not the dead straw gray of exhausted winter pasture either. Dale Pruitt drove by twice that week. He didn't stop, but he slowed down both times. A rancher named Emmett Cross, who Tamsin didn't know well, called her on a Thursday and asked stiffly, as though he'd rehearsed it, whether she'd be willing to talk sometime about what she was doing with the rotational sections. He said his daughter was studying environmental science and come home for a visit, and asked some questions he didn't know how to answer. Tamsin said she'd be glad to talk. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen, where Orson's notebooks were stacked at the end of the table, and the afternoon light came through the west window at an angle that made the dust motes visible. 21 bison now, with the 2 calves. 19 section fence crossings repaired since October. 1 county complaint successfully resolved. 1 brutal winter survived on a fraction of the supplemental feed she'd budgeted. 2 new calves on the ground, and the ridge grass was greening in February when it had no particular reason to. Most of its windows were dark. She pulled notebook 26 from the stack and opened it to the page she'd read the night before she went to the auction. The land isn't useless. It has simply been fed by the wrong animal. She'd read that sentence 40 or 50 times by now. It hadn't gotten less true. But lately, when she read it, she found herself thinking about the sentence from a different angle, not just about the land and the animal, but about the other thing Orson had been saying without saying it. About what happens when you apply the wrong standard of judgment to anything. The land, the animal, the person. She closed the notebook and went to check the water lines before dark, because there was always something that needed checking, and standing still thinking philosophical thoughts was something she could afford considerably less of than the ranch could afford of unnecessary hay. Spring came the way it always came to that part of the country reluctantly, with setbacks, with cold snaps that arrived after warm days and made you feel like the season had changed its mind. Tamsin was used to this. Orson had written about it in at least a dozen notebooks. The way spring on the high prairie was less a transition than a negotiation. By April, the negotiation was going her way. The sections the bison had grazed in the fall, the ridge sections, the native grass areas were coming back in a way she had hoped for, but hadn't been sure of. The deep-rooted bluestem was pushing up with the particular aggressive energy of plants that have rested well. The forbs she'd identified in October were spreading. Section 4, the one she'd overgrazed by mistake, had caught up more than she'd expected and was showing new growth in the bare patches she'd been most worried about. The overgrazed sections from Orson's rental years, the damaged ones she'd put the herd on last, and most carefully were slower. One of them still looked, in mid-April, like it might not recover at all. She walked it twice a week and tried to be patient about something that patience might not actually fix. Nell walked it with her one morning without being asked. She didn't say anything, for most of the walk, just looked at the ground. At the edge of the section, she stopped and used the toe of her boot to turn over a small section of soil the way a person does when they're looking for something specific. Orson worried about this section for years, she said. long before he let the neighbor put cattle on it. It was already thin. Maybe it's too far gone, Tamsin said. Nell considered this with the gravity she gave most things. Maybe. Maybe not. Give it another season before you decide. She looked up. Orson's had a section he'd written off completely by year 12. By year 20, it was his best grazing ground. What did he do to it? Rested it. Just left it alone. Stopped trying to fix it. Tamsin looked at the bare patches. So I'm supposed to do nothing. Sometimes doing nothing is the hardest correct decision, Nell said, and turned and walked back toward the house. The first time she sold bison meat, it happened almost accidentally. A man named Silas Fenwick had been running a small restaurant in the county seat for about 8 years. He was not a fancy restaurant, the kind of place that served things properly, without performing about it, with a menu that changed based on what was actually good rather than what was profitable to keep on the menu year-round. People drove distances to eat there, which was either a recommendation or a warning, depending on how far they drove. Silas had heard about the bison. He drove out to Windscar in May in a truck that needed a new muffler, introduced himself at the gate with a handshake that was brief and businesslike, and asked if he could buy a small amount of the meat. I'm not selling animals yet, Tamsin said. I'm not asking you to sell animals. I'm asking if you have any meat currently available. She had one, and she'd now processed in late winter the old cow that had been in the worst condition at the auction, and had never fully stabilized, who she'd lost in January, and had processed cleanly rather than waste. She had the meat in her freezer. She hadn't been planning to sell it, because she hadn't thought through the selling side yet. She sold Silas 20 pounds, at a price he named that was higher than she'd expected. He came back 3 weeks later. It's different, he said, at the gate, without preamble. Different how? The fat content, the flavor, the way it cooks. He paused. I've bought bison from 2 other operations, and it wasn't like this. What are you feeding them? Native grass, she said. Ridge grass mostly. The coarse stuff. He nodded slowly in the way of someone who is hearing something that explains something they'd already noticed. I want to buy more. I'm not selling more right now. He looked at her for a moment. He was a careful man. She could see that the kind of careful that came from having run a business long enough to understand that patience usually cost less than urgency. When will you be selling? He asked. When I have animals I can sell without shrinking the herd below what the land can support. And when is that? I don't know yet, she said. I'll call you. He left her his card. She put it in the drawer with Orson's warranty documents for equipment that no longer existed and the phone numbers of people she needed to remember. Eli was in the barn when she came back from the gate. He'd been cleaning waterers and had caught the tail end of the conversation from a distance. You turned down money, he said. I turned down selling animals I can't afford to sell. He would have paid well. I know. Eli was quiet for a moment, running the hose over the inside of a water trough. Some ranchers would have taken that money right now. In your position. Some ranchers would, she agreed. And in 3 years they wouldn't have a herd anymore, or a functioning prairie, or a reason for anyone to want the meat. She picked up the other hose. The land can only give so much. You take more than that, and you're not running a ranch. You're running a countdown. Eli looked at her with an expression she'd started to recognize, the one that meant he was taking notes, not in his physical notebook, but in the more permanent record he kept in his head, the one she suspected would still be there 30 years from now. Your grandfather wrote something like that, he said. In Notebook 31, I read it last week. She looked at him sharply. You've been reading the notebooks? You left them on the kitchen table. They're not, she stopped. They're fine. They're meant to be read. She paused. What did he say? Eli recited it with the exact precision of someone with a good memory who had read it carefully. Taking too much today destroys what could save everyone tomorrow. The hose was still running in her hand. She turned it off. Orson had written that in Notebook 31. She hadn't gotten to 31 yet. She stood in the barn, in the Maylight, listening to the herd moving in the east section, and she thought about a man who had spent 40 years writing down everything he'd learned about this piece of land, who had never gotten the chance to act on most of it, who had left it to a 22-year-old woman who was figuring it out one fence post, and one bad decision, and one cold morning at a time. She went back inside and started reading Notebook 31 that night. He had more to say than she'd expected. He always did. The bison outside were 21 now, moving through April grass that hadn't been this good in 20 years, on land that everyone had agreed was useless. Tended by a woman everyone had agreed wasn't up to it. They were all still wrong. And the hardest part wasn't behind her yet. The second shear started the way the first year had ended, with Tamsin making decisions she wasn't sure about and living with the consequences either way. The herd was 23 now. 2 more calves had come in early spring, both healthy, both on their feet faster than she'd expected. The limper, she'd stopped calling him that internally, but the name had stuck, had grown into a solid young bull who barely favored the bad leg at all anymore, and who had developed, over the past year, personality that Eli described charitably as assertive and that Tamsin described as a genuine problem waiting to happen. He wasn't wrong. The limper had started testing fences again, not because he wanted out, but because testing things was apparently what he did with his energy, and at 400 and some pounds, he was no longer the smallest animal in the pen. She'd had to reinforce Section 2's north gate twice in April alone. She was doing it a third time on a Thursday morning in May, when she heard Korev Hale's truck coming up the drive. She knew who he was before he introduced himself. Briar Hollow wasn't large enough for important people to be anonymous, and Corbin Hale was, by local standards, important. He owned a restaurant in the county seat, a second one in a city 40 miles north, and a catering operation that handled events across 3 counties. He was 50-something, well-dressed in the practical way of a man who needed to look put together without ruining clothing. And he walked up to her gate with the specific confidence of someone accustomed to people wanting to do business with him. Silas had sent him. She figured that out in the first 30 seconds. Silas Fenwick speaks highly of your operation. Corbin said, after the handshake, looking out at the pasture where a portion of the herd was grazing the East Ridge. He says the meat quality is unlike what he's seen from other grass-raised operations. Silas has been patient with me, Tamsin said. I appreciate that. He said you've been slow to sell. I've sold what I can sell without compromising the herd. Corbin nodded. He had the manner of a man who knew when not to push. I'd like to offer you a purchasing arrangement. Regular quantities, consistent pricing, premium per pound above what you're currently receiving from Silas. He named a price. She kept her face neutral, which required some effort, because the number was high enough to matter significantly in her current financial situation. How many animals, she asked. He told her. She looked at the pasture. Did the math she'd been doing for 2 years in her head, carrying capacity, recovery periods, herd growth rate, the sections that were still rebuilding, the damaged ground that needed another full season before she trusted it. The numbers she came to did not match the numbers he wanted. I can't sell that many, she said. He waited. If I sell that many animals this year, I drop below the minimum herd size I need to keep the rotation functioning properly. The Prairie recovery stalls. In 3 years, I don't have the product quality you're coming here for. She looked at him directly. So what you're actually offering me is good money now, in exchange for destroying the thing that makes the product worth the money. Corbin was quiet for a moment. He looked at the herd, looked back at her. What can you sell? He asked. She told him. It was less than a third of what he'd asked for. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might just walk back to his truck. The pricing still holds, he said finally, for whatever quantity you can provide. And when I can provide more, you'll have first consideration. That's what I can offer. He held out his hand. She shook it. Most of its windows were dark. When his truck was on the county road, she stood at the gate for a moment, then went back to fixing the latch that the limper had bent. Her hands were steady. She felt the particular satisfaction of a decision made for the right reason that was also going to be very difficult to live with financially for the next 6 months. She tightened the last bolt and tested the gate and went to find Nell, because Nell needed to know about the money situation, and Nell's opinion on financial decisions was one of the few she trusted completely. Most have listened without interrupting, which was how Nell handled things she considered serious. When Tamsin finished, Nell said, "You did right. It's going to be tight." It was already tight. Tighter. Nell refilled her coffee cup and sat back down. Orson turned down money 3 times that I can remember. Every time it cost him something in the short run. Every time it was the right call looking back. She wrapped both hands around the cup, He used to say the hardest thing about ranching wasn't the weather or the animals or the market. It was making yourself think past the next 6 months. Tamsin sat down across from her. I think about whether I'm being principled or just stubborn. What's the difference? I don't always know. Nell looked at her over the coffee cup with an expression that was as close to warm as Nell's face typically allowed. That uncertainty is the thing that makes you better at this than most people. The ones who are completely sure are the ones I worry about. Summer came in hot and stayed that way. This was not unusual for that part of the country, but this summer had an edge to it that the old teamers noticed and mentioned not as a complaint, more as an observation, the way you comment on something you've seen before and weren't hoping to see again. The creek in Windscar's eastern section went low in July, which was expected, but by mid-July it was lower than Tamsin had seen it. By the first week of August, it had stopped running entirely, sitting in disconnected pools that were shrinking by the day. She'd set up the secondary water system the previous fall, 4 stock tanks connected to the windmill in Section 3, and it was carrying most of the herd's water needs. But the windmill had been working harder than designed, and she'd had to replace a part in late July that cost more than she wanted to spend. She was watching the creek on a Tuesday afternoon when Eli appeared beside her. He'd finished whatever summer work he had at home and was spending most days at Windscar now. She'd started paying him something, not much but real, which he accepted without making any comment about it in either direction, which told her something about his situation at home that she didn't ask about. I looked up the county rain records, Eli said, going back 40 years. She already knew from his tone that she wasn't going to like what he'd found. 3 years in the last 40 where August rainfall was this low. 2 of those went into significant drought conditions by September. One of them was the worst dry year the county's since the 60s. And the third broke in late August. Good fall rain. She looked at the pools left in the creek bed. What do the current forecasts say? Nothing certain. She'd expected that. Weather forecasting in this part of the country was a science built on fundamental uncertainty, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling something. She started checking the water situation in every section every morning. She moved the rotation schedule early section, not by much, but enough to keep the grass from being pushed too hard under the heat stress. She contacted the county extension office about drought monitoring. She drove her perimeter roads and counted the water available at each point and wrote the numbers in a notebook she'd bought specifically for this purpose, which left on the kitchen table next to the stacks of Orson's notebooks. In the 3rd week of August, the rain that the forecast had kept saying was possible did not come. In the last week of August, it still did not come. By September, the county was in an official drought advisory. Tamsin'd seen drought before she'd grown up in this country, had heard Orson and Nell describe bad years, but seeing it happening to land she was responsible for was a different experience than knowing it happened. The sky took on the particular white-hot quality of a long dry spell, the kind of light that looks like the sun has been on too long and needs to rest. The grass in the non-native sections, the areas that had been overgrazed and were still recovering, stopped growing and began to go dull at the edges. The sections she'd built up with the bison rotation were different, not dramatic about it, not some movie version of green versus brown, but the difference was real and measurable. The deep-rooted native grasses held moisture differently than the shallow-rooted forage grasses in the conventional pastures. The root systems the bison grazing had encouraged, the ones that went down 4 and 5 feet into the soil, were accessing water that the surface was no longer providing. The sections were stressed. They weren't dying. She drove Section 3 on a Wednesday morning in mid-September and crouched down and put her hand on the ground and felt something she hadn't been sure she'd feel. There was still give in the soil. Still some moisture at the surface level. Not much, but some. She sat back on her heels and looked at the sky. That's of its notes were dark. That same week, across the fence on Dale Pruitt's north pasture, she could see his cattle clustered around his remaining water points, with the particular restlessness of animals that aren't getting enough. Dale's hay deliveries had started in August. She'd seen 3 trucks come down his road in 2 weeks. She felt something watching that. Not satisfaction, it wasn't that. It was closer to dread, because she understood what she was looking at. What was happening to Dale was going to happen to more people. The drought wasn't going to lift by October. She could feel it in the air, in the ground, in the way the bison were behaving slightly more deliberate in their grazing, ranging farther in each section, not panicking but making adjustments. They knew before she did, she thought. They always knew before she did. The first week of October, she got a call from Dale Pruitt. "I'm going to have to sell down," he said. He didn't explain what he meant because she already knew moving cattle to market before you were ready because you couldn't feed them, taking whatever price was available because the alternative was watching them deteriorate. It was the worst economic position a livestock rancher could be in. You sold too many at a bad price and you spent years rebuilding. "I wanted to ask you something first." "Ask." "That section on your south boundary, the big rest section you've got sitting empty." She knew which one. Section 6, she'd given it a full rest year. No grazing, just recovery. It was one of the sections showing the best response to the rotation. She'd planned to bring the bison through it in late October. "What about it?" she asked, although she already knew. "I've got 40 head I'm trying to save. My best breeding stock. If I put them on the market now, I lose 8 years of selection." He paused. "I know it's a lot to ask." She looked at the notebook on the table. Not Orson's, her own. The water numbers, the section conditions, the recovery timelines. "Dale," she said, "I can't put 40 head of cattle in Section 6. That section has been building for a year and a half. 40 cattle would set it back to where it started." Silence on the line. "But I might be able to do something different," she said. "Can you come out tomorrow?" He came out the next morning. She walked him through what she had in mind, not Section 6, but the East Section 1, which had been through a flotation already and could handle measured pressure if it was careful and time-limited. Specific rules. Limited duration. She'd managed the water and the timing herself. Dale stood at the fence of Section 1 and looked at the grass with the eyes of a man who hadn't seen grass that looked like this in weeks. "How many?" he asked. She'd already calculated it. 30. Not 40. 30 for 6 weeks maximum. And if the grass tells me it's going too fast, they come off earlier. "My 40 best are 30, she said, not hard, not aggressive. Just the number she'd arrived at and wasn't moving from. And since he was quiet for a moment, "Okay, 30. And you follow my rotation schedule exactly. You don't move them yourself. You don't add supplemental feed without telling me. You don't make decisions about the section on your own." He looked at her. In another context, another time, a man like Dale Pruitt being given conditions by a 23-year-old woman about what he could and couldn't do with his own cattle would have produced a very different conversation. But this wasn't another context. This was October in a drought year, and his cattle were going to market at bad prices if Winscar's grass wasn't available, and they both knew it. "Agreed," he said. She shook his hand and spent the next 2 days setting up the arrangement so it wouldn't damage what she'd built. Garrick Vane found out about it the following week. She didn't know how Briar Hollow being Briar Hollow, information moved through the community like water through soil, finding every crack and low point without anyone directing it. What she knew was that he called her on a Thursday evening, and the call was the first time he'd contacted her directly since the county fence complaint the previous winter. "You're letting Pruitt graze your land," he said. "Not a question. 30 head of his cattle on one section for 6 weeks," she said. "Under my conditions." "Your conditions." "My land." "My conditions." A beat of silence. "What are you charging him?" she told him. Another silence. "That's below market for drought grazing." "Yes. You could charge him 3 times that right now, and he'd have to pay it." "I know." She waited. "So why aren't you?" Garrick asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. She thought about how to say it. "Because I'm not selling a scarce resource to a neighbor in trouble. I'm keeping an agreement with someone who's going to be in this county long after the drought is over. And because the rate I charged is what the section can support without being taken advantage of, which is the only way I'm willing to use it." The line was quiet for long enough that she checked to make sure the call was still connected. "That's not how most people would handle it," Garrick said finally. "I know," she said. He hung up without anything else, which was so characteristic of Garrick Vane that she almost smiled. Word traveled fast after Dale's cattle went into Section 1. Tamsin had expected curiosity. What she hadn't expected was the volume of it not public, not announced, but steady. Trucks slowing on the county road. A call from Emmett Cross. A message relayed through the feed store that 2 other ranchers wanted to talk. She talked to all of them. What she told them was the same thing she'd told Dale. She had limited capacity, specific conditions, non-negotiable rules about how the land was used. Some of them found the conditions too strict and walked away, which she expected. Few accepted, and she took their livestock in carefully calculated numbers on carefully chosen sections. By the 3rd week of October, Windscar's available grazing sections were carrying their maximum load. She had a list on the kitchen wall, updated daily, of section conditions and animal numbers and the point at which each section would need to rest. She checked it every morning and every evening. She also had, for the first time since the auction, a positive cash flow. Not large, not the scale Corbin Hale had wanted to give her in May, but real money coming in steadily from a drought that was destroying operations across Briar Hollow, while Windscar stood on 2 years of careful prairie restoration and weathered it differently. The irony was not lost on her. The county's worst agricultural year in decades was the year that made the clearest case for what she'd been doing. Eli understood this with a precision she appreciated. He sat at the kitchen table one evening in late October, looking at the section map she'd updated, and said, "The drought didn't create this, just made the difference visible." That's exactly what it did. "How many of them know that?" he asked. "The ranchers who are coming to you, do they understand that it's the restoration that's making this possible? Or do they think you just got lucky?" Tamsin considered this. "I think some of them are starting to understand. Dale knows. Emmett's getting there." She looked at the map. "Some of them just want to survive this year. They'll figure out the why later. Or they won't. And you're okay with that?" "I'm okay with people figuring things out at whatever pace they're able to," she said. "I'm not okay with them using this land in ways that damage it. Those are different things." Eli nodded. He was 16 now, a fact that Tamsin occasionally found startling. She'd gotten so used to treating him as a working partner that she sometimes forgot the age gap between them and what it meant. He thought more clearly than most adults she'd met, and had a quality she'd started to think of as rare: the ability to hold a complicated idea without immediately trying to simplify it into something more comfortable. He'd filled 3 notebooks since they'd started working together. She'd read most of what he'd written with his permission and found that he wasn't just recording facts and observations. He was building a framework, connecting the specific things happening at Windscar to the broader principles, asking questions at the margins that she often didn't have answers to, and that sometimes led to decisions she wouldn't have made otherwise. He was good. Not in the prodigy sense that people use to describe children who perform adult tasks adequately. Good in the sense of someone who was finding their actual work in the world, the thing they were built to care about and do, and doing it with the full attention that only comes when that alignment happens. She was careful not to take too much of his time. He had school. He had a family situation she still hadn't asked about directly. But she'd started paying him at a real rate in October. And she'd told him plainly that if he wanted to keep working at Windscar after he graduated, there would be a place for that conversation. He hadn't said anything then. He just nodded with that same expression, taking notes in the permanent record. Harlan Creed showed up on a Thursday morning in early November when the sky had gone flat and gray and smelled like cold rain that hadn't arrived yet. Tamsin knew Harlan the way she knew most of the county's ranchers by name and reputation rather than personal familiarity. He was in his late 50s, ran a mid-sized operation north of town, and had a reputation for doing things the way they'd always been done, with a stubbornness that the community read as reliability. He'd been at the auction the day she bought the Bison. She remembered him in the group behind Garrick, one of the faces that had carried an expression of amused dismissal before the auctioneer's gavel came down. He drove a truck that had clearly not had a good year, and he looked the same way, functional but strained, like something that had been run hard and was still going, but wouldn't be for much longer without serious attention. He came to the gate, and she met him there, without waiting for him to knock. He didn't ease into it. "I've got 120 head I can't feed through December," he said. "The bank wants to see a feeding plan by end of next week, or they're calling the line of credit." He looked at the pasture behind her. "Dale Pruitt told me you helped him." She waited. "I know I'm not in a position to negotiate," Harlan said. Something in his voice was careful, not quite pride, but the last edge of it. I'm asking because I don't have other options. 120 is too many, she said. He nodded once, like he'd expected that. What number works? He asked. She'd been thinking since she saw his truck coming up the drive, running the section math in her head, the available sections, the current load, the recovery timelines, what the land could take before she was doing to it, what the drought was doing to everyone else's land. 60, she said, for 8 weeks, with the same conditions I've given the others. He nodded again. The other 60? The others go to market or they don't. That's not something I can solve for you. It was a hard thing to say. She said it because it was true, and because softening it wouldn't make it less true, just less clear. Harlan's jaw tightened. She watched him process at the math of 60 instead of 120, what he'd have to sell, and at what price, what it would mean for his operation. She watched him arrive at the same place in place 2 years ago, standing at an auction window, counting pit money she didn't have, the place where the decision is made and the door locks behind you. 60, he said. The conditions are written down. I'll get you a copy. He looked at her for a moment. He had the specific look of a man who was trying to decide something and not succeeding at hiding the difficulty of it. I was at the auction, he said, when you bought those animals. She didn't say anything. I thought he stopped. Started again. I thought Garrick was right. Most people did, she said. Not to punish him. Just stating a fact. I'm not sure what to do with being wrong about something that long, he said. She thought about that. You don't have to do anything with it right now. You've got 60 cattle coming here next week and an 8-week window to figure out your December plan. That's enough to manage. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not gratitude exactly, more like a recalibration. Like the category he'd been keeping her in had finally stopped fitting, and he had to build a new one. Yeah, he said. Okay. She got him the condition sheet, and he drove back down the road. Eli had been in the barn and had seen the truck. He came out when it was gone. Who was that Harlan Creed? Eli thought. He was at the auction. He was. Is he the one? He searched his memory. He was laughing. A lot of people were laughing, Tamsin said. And you're letting his cattle on Section 5. 60 of them. For 8 weeks. Eli was quiet for a moment. Doesn't it bother you? Helping the people who... Yes, she said. Sometimes. He waited. But the land doesn't care who laughed, she said. The grass grows back the same way regardless, and the people who need help need it, whether or not they were kind to me 2 years ago. She looked at the pasture. If I only helped people who'd been decent to me, I'd be helping 3 people in this county. Eli said, I'm decent. She looked at him. Most of the time, he added. She almost smiled. Get the water lines checked in Section 5 before it gets dark. Harlan's cattle arrived Thursday. The drought broke in mid-November in a way nobody had predicted, not a gradual return of moisture, but 3 days of hard, slow rain that came in off the southwest and sat over the county like it had decided to stay for a while. The kind of rain that didn't run off, just soaked in, the ground accepting it the way a dry sponge accepts water, steadily and without spectacle. Tamsin stood on the porch on the second mornings of it and watched the sections and listened to the sound of rain on the barn roof and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since August. Nell came to the door behind her. This is the rain that ends it, Nell said. She'd seen enough droughts to recognize the ones that were over. Yes. How's the land? Better than it should be, Tamsin said. Considering that you spent 2 years doing things correctly, Nell said, which for her was approximately a standing ovation. Eli called that evening from home, where he'd been kept by some family obligation she hadn't asked about. Is it raining there? He asked. 2 days straight. How's Section 3 looking? Because Section 3 was the one they'd both worried about, most the damaged section, the one with the bare patches, the one Nell had said to leave alone and trust. Green, Tamsin said, and that was not quite right, not yet. But it was closer to green than it had been in 2 years. And in the rain light, it was as close to a promise as land ever made. She heard him breathe out on the other end of the line. Okay, he said. Good. The drought, when it ended, left behind a county that was divided not by any line on a map, but by a simpler distinction. The places that had been worked with what the land was, and the places that had been worked against it. The difference was visible from a truck window on any county road. It wasn't permanent the conventional pastures would recover, The good ranchers would learn and adjust. The rain was rain for everyone. But in that specific November, on that specific landscape, the distinction between 2 years of careful work and 2 years of business as usual was written in the grass itself. And on the county road that ran along Winscar's east boundary, more than one truck slowed down that week for longer than it needed to. The Bison had been moved back into the main rotation the week before the rain came. They were in Section 2, working the ridge grass in the gray November light, and from the road they looked exactly like what they were, animals completely at home in the landscape they were standing in, doing the work they were built to do, on ground that was doing what it was capable of doing when given the chance. 27 of them now, 27 from 19, from a pen that everyone at that auction had already written off before the bidding started. The hardest part of the story, it turned out, wasn't behind Tamsin at all, but the part she hadn't been sure she could survive the first winter, the thin margins, the drought, the weight of being wrong in small ways while trying to be right about the large ones. That part was through. What was coming next was different. Not easier, but different. The rain that ended the drought also ended something else, the particular anonymity Tamsin had maintained by being easy to dismiss. It is one thing to be ignored. It is another to be watched. And after November, Winscar Ranch was being watched by the kind of attention that doesn't announce itself but shows up in small ways, the extra long pause. When her name came up at the feed store, the slight recalibration in how men who'd laughed at the auction now positioned themselves in conversations about range management, the steady trickle of trucks on the county road that slowed at her east boundary fence without quite stopping. She noticed all of it. She didn't know what to do with most of it. Problem with suddenly mattering to people who had previously decided you didn't was that you had to figure out, quickly and without much guidance, what you owed them and what you didn't. Tamsin had spent 2 years operating on the assumption that she was mostly on her own, making decisions in a space where the primary audience was the land itself, and whether it was responding. That had been clarifying in its way. Hard but clarifying. Now she had ranchers calling with questions and a county extension officer, who'd switched from monitoring her fence compliance to asking if she'd consider speaking at an agricultural meeting, and a complicated, unresolved awareness that what she'd built on Winscar was starting to mean something beyond the ranch boundaries. She was sitting with this on a cold December morning when the call came from Garrick Vane. Not through an intermediary this time. Not a fence complaint filed through an official channel. His direct number on her phone at 7:15 in the morning. A time that suggested he'd been thinking about it long enough to make up his mind. She answered on the third ring. "I'd like to come out," he said. No greeting, no preamble, just that, in the flat, direct tone of a man who had decided something and wasn't interested in spending words on the approach. "When?" she said. "This week, if that works." She looked at the section map on the wall, at the notebook she'd been updating that morning, at the stack of Orson's notebooks at the end of the table that had been a permanent fixture of the kitchen for over 2 years now. "Thursday afternoon," she said. 2 o'clock. He arrived at 1:55, which told her something. A man who didn't respect you arrived late or right on time. A man trying to make a point arrived 5 minutes early. She met him at the gate. He was older than she remembered from the auction, which was strange because it had only been a little over 2 years. But drought years aged people the way hard winters aged animals, not just time passing, but something being used up. He'd lost weight she hadn't noticed he'd been carrying. His operation had taken serious losses in the drought, and the county knew it, the way the county knew most things. He stood at the fence and looked at the pasture for a while, without speaking. The herd was in Section 4 today, 27 animals moving through the late fall native grass, with the unhurried purposefulness she'd spent 2 years observing and still found something close to beautiful. 27, he said. From 19, she said. He nodded once. I heard you helped Harlan Creed. 60 of his cattle. 8 weeks. I heard you turned down the other 60. The land could handle 60, not 120. He was quiet for a moment. The bull, the original bull, the one who had originally searched on the loading ramp for 22 minutes deciding whether to get on the trailer, was at the far edge of the section, his enormous dark shape moving slowly against the pale winter grass. He'd put on significant weight since the auction. His coat was thick and even. He looked, at this distance, like An animal that belonged so completely to this landscape that removing him from it would require explaining why the landscape had been wrong. He was right, Garrick said. She didn't ask who he meant. Orson, about this land. He turned slightly to look at her, not quite facing her directly. I told him once, maybe 15 years ago, that he was wasting time on theories when he should have been running cattle properly. He listened to me the way he listened to everybody, took it in, didn't argue, didn't agree. I thought he was being polite about being wrong. A pause. Turns out he was being polite about something else, entirely. Tamsin looked at the herd. He wrote about that conversation, she said. Not about you specifically, but about being told the theories weren't worth pursuing. Garrick's expression shifted, something tightened in it that wasn't quite guilt, but was in the same territory. What did he write? He wrote that the people who were most certain he was wrong were the ones who never tried to prove it either way. They just decided. She paused. He didn't write it angrily. He wrote it like he was trying to understand something. Garrick looked back at the pasture. He was a better man than I gave him credit for being. Yes, she said, he was. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The wind moved through the ridge grass with the dry whisper of late fall, the sound that Tamsin had come to associate with this particular place and no other place in the world. I'm not here to ask you to save what's left of my operation, Garrick said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not coming to you with my hat in my hand asking for a section of grazing land. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small photograph, held it for a moment, then handed it across the fence to her. It was a boy, maybe 12 or 13, in the photograph. Dark-haired, serious-faced, standing next to a very large roan horse, with his hand on the horse's neck in the way kids stand with horses when they want to look capable, and haven't quite gotten there yet. My grandson, Garrick said. Marcus, he's 13. He's been with me every summer since he was 8. A pause. He asks better questions than I know how to answer. About the land. About how things work. Another pause longer. After this year, after the drought, after watching what happened here compared to what happened, everywhere else he came to me in October and said sicksawed, Grandpa, why didn't we do what Ms. Rourke did? And I didn't have a good answer. Tamsin looked at the photograph. The boast of its were dark. The boy had the serious look a kid who had already started to understand that the adults around him didn't always have everything figured out, and who had decided to pay attention anyway. What are you asking? She said. I want him to learn this, Garrick said. Not from a book, not from a program at the extension office. From you, from being here and watching how this works and understanding why. He took the photograph back when she held it out, looked at it once, put it back in his pocket. I'm asking if you'd be willing to teach my grandson. She hadn't expected this. She'd considered, in a general way, that Garrick would eventually come to some reckoning with what the drought had made visible. She hadn't imagined it would look like this specific, this personal, this stripped of the armor that men like Garrick Vane usually kept on in any interaction that cost them something. He'd have to do real work, she said. Not watching. Not touring. If he's here, he's working. He'd expect that. And I'd want him to understand what he's seeing, not just how to do the tasks. The why matters as much as the how. That's what I want him to learn. She looked at the herd. The bull had moved to the center of the section and was grazing steadily, working through the native bluestem with the focused attention of an animal doing what it was designed to do. Have him come in the spring, she said, when the rotation starts again. That's when there's the most to see. Garrick nodded. His jaw worked briefly, like he was measuring what he wanted to say against what he trusted himself to say. I was wrong about you, he said. I said it publicly at the auction, been publicly now. And I should say it publicly now, but I'm saying it to you first because you're the one I said it in front of. She held his gaze. I know. I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking for anything from that, he said. I just needed to say it plainly. It's said, she told him. He held out his hand. She shook it. And then he drove back down the road, and she stood at the gate for a moment, watching the truck go, feeling something settle in her chest that wasn't triumph and wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something quieter than both of those, something closer to the feeling of a long problem finally arriving at its actual shape. She told Nell that evening. Nell listened with her arms folded and her coffee going cold and her face doing the thing it did when she was making sense of something she'd been expecting but didn't know quite when to expect. He sent the boy, Nell said when Tamsin finished. He asked if I'd teach him. Not the same as sending him, but close. Nell picked up her coffee cup, registered that it was cold, set it back down. Garrick's way of saying he was wrong is to give you the person he cares most about, so you can make sure the next generation doesn't make the same mistakes. She paused. That's more than most men do. I know. Are you going to be able to do it? Teach someone else's grandson when Nell stopped. When we don't have our own, Tamsin said. Nell looked at her with the particular directness she used when she thought a thing needed to be named rather than circled. I'm 24, Tamsin said. I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm not asking you to worry about it. I'm asking if teaching that boy is going to be fine, Nell. She said it quietly, not dismissively, just with the steadiness of someone who had decided what she could carry and what she couldn't right now, and was clear on the difference. Nell looked at her for another moment, then nodded once. Subject closed. Orson would have liked this, Nell said. Having someone to pass the notebooks to. He already passed them to me. He passed them to you because you were the only one listening. Nell stood up slowly, the way she did now that the cold had settled into her joints. Now more people are listening. That's what he wanted. That's what all of it was for. She went to bed, and Tamsin sat at the kitchen table with notebook 38 open, in front of her the last notebook. Orson had filled before he got too sick to write much, and read the final pages she'd been saving without quite meaning to. His handwriting in the last section was difficult. Not impossible, but the effort was visible in it. The shaky determination of a man getting something down because he needed it to be somewhere other than inside himself. The last full entry was dated 14 months before he died. I don't know who will work this land after me. I know what I want for it. I want it to show what it can do when it's treated as something with its own intelligence. Prairie knows what it needs. It's been waiting a long time for someone to stop arguing with it and start listening. Whoever ends up here, I hope they're a better listener than I was at the start. It took me too many years to stop being certain and start paying attention. I hope they get there faster. She closed the notebook. Outside, the December wind moved across the ridge. Inside the warm kitchen, under a lamp that no longer buzzed, because she'd finally fixed the wiring in October, she sat with the weight of a dead man's notebooks, and a living man's grandson coming, in the spring and 2027 Bison, on restored Prairie and $63 that had become, through 2 years of careful and imperfect and occasionally humiliating work, something she hadn't been sure she'd ever have the right to call a real ranch. She thought about what she owed the land, what she owed Orson, what she owed the people who'd come to her in the drought with their hats in their hands and their cattle going thin. And she thought about what she owed herself, which was a shorter list, but an important one. Pulled a blank notebook from the drawer she'd bought a stack of them at the beginning, knowing she'd need them, and opened it to the first page and wrote the date. Then she sat for a while thinking about what she wanted to say, and then she started writing. Marcus Vane arrived the following April on a morning that couldn't decide between spring and winter, cold enough that his breath showed but bright enough that the south-facing sections were already showing the green that came earlier every year, as the root systems deepened and the soil built. He was taller than his photograph and more serious, if possible. He had a small, spiral notebook in his back pocket, which she noticed immediately and which told her something useful. Garrick had driven him out and was going to pick him up at the end of the day. He stood at the gate with his grandson, and there was something in the way he stood there, not hovering, not anxious. Most of his windows were dark, but present in a way that fathers and grandfathers sometimes were at moments they recognized as significant that she found unexpectedly moving. She shook Marcus's hand. His handshake was careful and serious, clearly practiced. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked him. He thought about it. Not the eager to please, thinking of a kid trying to give the right answer, but real thinking. "My grandfather says you understand this land better than anyone in the county, and that understanding it is more important than he realized." A pause. "And I want to understand it. What do you already know?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out the spiral notebook and held it up. "I've been writing down questions for about 4 months. Things I didn't know how to ask my grandfather." He paused again. "There are a lot of them." She looked at the notebook. Then she looked back at Garrick, who was watching his grandson with the watching his of a man seeing something clearly that he'd only been able to see with one eye before. "Come on," she said to Marcus. "I'll introduce you to the herd." She walked him to the section where the bison were grazing. Section 3, the damaged section, The one she'd been told to leave alone. The one that had shown up green after the drought rains and hadn't looked back since. It was the section she was most proud of, precisely because it was the one she'd done the least to. Marcus stood at the fence and looked at the herd. He didn't say anything for a long time. She was already learning. Characteristic of him, he let things sit before he responded to them, which was rare in a 13-year-old and rare in most adults. They're bigger than I expected, he said finally. The bull especially. Which one's the bull? She pointed. The original bull she'd never named him and didn't intend to was in the middle of the herd, grazing steadily, the huge dark shape of him anchoring the group the way a good lead animal always did. He was the first one off the trailer when I brought them here, she said, or he was supposed to be. He stopped halfway up the ramp and stood there for 22 minutes. Marcus looked at her. What did you do? Waited. He thought about this. Because pushing him would have made it worse. Because pushing him would have made it much worse. And also because he was going to go when he decided to go, and my wanting him to go faster was my problem, not his. Marcus wrote something in his notebook. She caught 2 words, own timeline. She spent the rest of the morning walking him through the sections, the rotation map, the recovery periods, the difference between sections that had been working well and the one that was still building. Most of its windows were dark. She explained the root systems and the water retention and the relationship between the grazing pattern and what grew back. She used Orson's language when it was clearer than her own, which it often was. And she had caught Zamarka the language came from. He asked good questions, not always the right questions, but good ones. Specific enough that she could tell he'd been actually thinking about what he'd seen, rather than waiting for an opportunity to demonstrate that he had questions ready. He got things wrong sometimes, and she corrected him directly, without softening it, in the way adults usually softened, corrections to children, and he took the corrections the same way he took everything, seriously, and without drama. By the afternoon, he was helping her with a waterlines check in Section 5. He wasn't fast or technically skilled, but he was paying attention to what she was doing, in a way that meant he was going to be faster and more skilled after watching it a few times. At one point, wrestling with a connection that wasn't quite cooperating, she said something impatient under her breath that she immediately regretted. Marcus looked up. He'd heard it clearly. Sorry, she said. It's okay. He went back to holding the section of pipe she'd asked him to hold. Then my grandfather swears at equipment too. Does he? He says the difference between a good rancher and a bad one isn't whether they lose their temper at inanimate objects. It's whether they take it out on people instead. She looked at him over the pipe fitting. Your grandfather said that? Last month, after the drought. A pause. He's been different since the drought. She tightened the fitting and tested the seal. Different how? Marcus thought about it. Quieter. He asks more questions than he used to. He used to just tell people things. Now sometimes he asks first. The boy paused again. I think it was a hard year for him. Not just the money. Hard years change people, she said. Did this change you? He asked. Careful, but direct. The same quality his grandfather had, she realized the willingness to say the actual thing when others circled it. She considered the question honestly. I went into this thinking I knew enough to make it work. I didn't. The first year taught me how much I didn't know, and every year since has continued that. She gathered the tools and stood up. So yes, it changed me. I'm less certain about most things than I was when I started, but more certain about the things that actually matter. Marcus wrote in his notebook. She didn't read it this time. Some notes were private. Eli came by that evening after Garrick had picked Marcus up. He'd been at a college tour, 2 counties over. He was going to study rangeland ecology, a decision he'd made with the same quiet certainty that characterized most of his important decisions, and she was prouder of it than she knew how to say out loud. He found her at the kitchen table with her own notebooks and Orson's side by side, doing the section notes she did every evening. How was the kid? He asked. Good. Better than good, actually. Eli sat down across from her. He was 17 now, angular in the way of a boy who'd grown fast, and not quite caught up with himself, with the same careful eyes he'd had at 15 when he'd appeared at the auction fence watching everything. Garrick's grandson, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, that's a lot. That he sent the kid here. I know. Eli looked at the notebooks. You're okay with it? She set down her pen. You mean because of the history? Because the man tried to run you out of the county with a fence complaint 18 months ago. He did, she said, and now he's sending his grandson to learn from me because the drought proved him wrong in front of everyone. She paused. I don't know if that makes him a big person or just a practical one, but either way, the kid deserves to learn what there is to learn here. His grandfather's character isn't his responsibility. Eli was quiet for a moment. You really believe that? I really believe that. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly in the way he did when he was assembling something. You know what the difference is between you and how most people would handle it? Tell me. Most people would help Garrick's grandson and keep a running account of the debt. Use it. Make sure everyone knew they were the bigger person. He brought his gaze back down to her. You're not doing that. There's no account, she said. It just costs too much to maintain. People would say you should get something from it. After everything. I'm getting something, she said. I'm getting to watch that kid figure out what my grandfather already knew. That's not nothing. Eli nodded slowly. Then, I've been thinking about after graduation. She waited. The rangeland ecology program is good. I want to go. He paused. But I don't want to lose this. He made a small gesture that encompassed the table, the notebooks, the ranch in general, what we've built here. I don't want to just read about it in textbooks. You could come back, she said, when you're done. If you want, you'd have room for that? She looked around the kitchen, at the section map on the wall with its notations, at her notebooks stacked beside orchards, at the window where the early spring dark showed the outline of the ridge against the sky. The ranch is going to grow, she said. Not fast. Not beyond what the land can support. But it's going to grow, and the work is going to grow with it. She looked at him. I'd rather build it with someone who understands it than train someone new. Eli nodded. He didn't say thank you, which she appreciated. He just nodded and pulled one of Orson's notebooks from the stack and opened it to a page he'd marked weeks ago, with a folded piece of paper, and started reading. She went back to her section notes. Outside, the spring was settling in over the ridge, tentative but real, the way it came every year reluctantly, with setbacks, like it wasn't sure it was supposed to stay. The trouble she hadn't seen coming arrived in June, when the County Agricultural Board formally proposed a new grazing ordinance. She found out about it the way she found about most county business through Nell, who had a network of information sources that Tamsin had given up trying to understand and had learned simply to trust. The ordinance, as proposed, would require all non-standard livestock operations. Bison were specifically named, along with elk and a handful of other species, to maintain perimeter fencing that met standards significantly above the current county codes. The standards were, on their face, about public safety. In practice, they would require Tamsin to rebuild a substantial portion of Windscar's perimeter. Fencing at a cost that she had, Nell said, calculated already. $40,000, Nell said, give or take. Tamsin set down her coffee. The board meeting is in 3 weeks, Nell said. You have a right to speak. Who proposed it? Nell's expression communicated that this was not a difficult question to answer and that she was surprised Tamsin needed to ask. Garrick's not on the board anymore, Tamsin said. Stepped down last year. He's not on the board, Nell agreed, and the tone she used, when the distinction she was drawing, was important and she expected Tamsin to catch it. Tamsin thought about it. Someone who's still on the board. Someone who she stopped Hollis. Roy Tenner, Nell said. Roy Tenner was 61 years old, had been on the county ag board for 12 years, and ran a cattle operation on the west side of the county that had barely survived the drought and had been making decisions for decades that looked, in the current light, considerably less sound than they'd seemed at the time. Got 3 people on the board who'll vote with him on anything he brings, with a safety justification attached to it. This would shut me down, Tamsin said. That fencing cost, I can't absorb that right now. I know. It would take everything I've built, and she stopped. He knows that, yes, Nell said. He knows. Tamsin was quiet for a long time. This was if its windows were dark. This was a different kind of problem than the drought, different than the fence complaint, different than the financial pressure of the early years. Those had been problems she could work against with her own hands, with the land's response, with time and patience, and the simple accumulation of results. This was a political problem, and she was not a political person. And the people she was up against had been working this particular room for 20 years longer than she'd been alive. She went through 3 days of fury so controlled that only Nell could see it, which was the most controlled fury she was capable of. Then she called Dale Pruitt. Then she called Emmett Cross. Then she called Harlan Creed. She drove out to see 2 other ranchers whose cattle had survived the drought, partly because of Windscar's grazing sections. She did not ask them for favors. She explained the situation plainly and let them draw their own conclusions, which they were capable of drawing without her assistance. Within a week, she had 5 ranchers willing to speak at the board meeting. She found out through the Briar Hollow information network that operated through Nell and several other sources she'd identified over 3 years that Roy Tenner had not expected this. He'd expected Tamsin to show up alone or with Eli, present her case to a board that would listen politely, and vote the way it had planned to vote. He had not expected Dale Pruitt and Harlan Creed to request speaking time. The board meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the county building that smelled of old carpet and the specific institutional coffee of every county building in every small agricultural community in the country. Tamsin sat in the second row with Eli on one side and Dale Pruitt on the other. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up and did not use notes. She walked the board through Windscar's fencing history, every inspection, every upgrade, every documented compliance check over 3 years. She walked them through the incident record because there was one and she presented it herself rather than waiting for someone else to present it. The loose animals in year 1, the measures she'd taken in response, the incident-free record of the past 2 years. She was specific and factual and spoke in the flat, precise language of someone who had spent 3 years learning to document everything because she'd suspected she might need it. Then she sat down. Dale spoke. He was brief and direct and said, essentially, that the ordinance as written would impose costs on a neighbor whose operation had, in the hardest year the county had seen in decades, provided a resource that saved a portion of his breeding herd. He said he found the timing and the specificity of the ordinance to be curious given that context. Harlan Creed was blunter. He said that if the board wanted to discuss perimeter fencing standards for non-domestic livestock, he'd support a general review of all grazing operations in the county, not a targeted ordinance aimed at one property. The meeting went on for 2 hours. It was not simple, and it was not clean, and at several points it was uncomfortable in the way small-town political processes became uncomfortable when people who had to live and work alongside each other were in direct disagreement in public. The ordinance failed on a 4-3 vote. Afterward, in the parking lot, Roy Tenner walked past her without speaking. She let him pass. Dale appeared at her elbow. You okay? Yes. He's not done, I know, she said. Neither am I. She drove home through the June dark and found Nell still awake, which wasn't unusual. Nell slept less than anyone Tamsin had ever known and seemed to regard the fact with mild impatience rather than concern. Well, Nell said. It failed. Nell nodded once. Orson had 3 county board fights in his time here. Lost 2, won 1. She looked at Tamsin. His record doesn't have to be yours. It won't be, Tamsin said, and she meant it in both directions. By the end of that 3rd full year, the bison herd had reached 34. The number mattered less to her than the condition of the animals and the land they were running on. The herd could be 100 animals and mean nothing if the prairie beneath them was being consumed rather than sustained. But 34 well-conditioned animals on native grass that was measurably healthier than it had been 3 years ago. That was the number that mattered. The rate, the direction. She'd started leasing section used to 2 neighboring properties whose owners wanted to begin their own restoration work. Not Bison, she wasn't in a position to advise on that yet, and wasn't sure she wanted the liability but rotational practices based on what she'd been doing with her oversight. It brought in additional income, and more importantly, it extended what Windscar was doing beyond Windscar's fence lines in a way that felt like the right next step. Emmett Cross's daughter had spent 2 weeks at Windscar in August, working with Eli and taking notes with the focused energy of a graduate student who had finally found a field site that matched what she'd been studying in theory. She'd asked technical questions that challenged Tamsin and prompted her to go back to Orson's notebooks looking for observations she'd read too fast the first time. Marcus Vane came back 4 more times before the summer ended. He was getting better, more efficient, more observant, asking fewer questions that he could have answered himself if he'd thought it through. He and Eli had developed the kind of working rapport that skips the social niceties because both parties are too interested in the actual work to bother, which Tamsin found simultaneously useful and faintly amusing. On his last visit of the season, Marcus asked her something while they were checking the water levels in Section 6. "Do you think my grandfather understands now what your grandfather was trying to do?" She thought about Garrick standing at the fence in December. The photograph of the serious-faced boy, the handshake. "I think he understands more than he did," she said. "Whether that's the same as understanding completely, I don't know. Maybe that's enough." Marcus considered this. He doesn't talk about the auction anymore. He used to mention it sometimes, kind of as a joke. He doesn't do that now. "No," she said, "I imagine he doesn't." The boy looked at the section in front of them, the grass moving in the late summer light, dense and deep-rooted in a way that the county road surveys from 3 years ago would not have predicted for this ground. "This is going to keep getting better, isn't it?" he asked. Not rhetorical. Actually asking if it's managed right. "Yes, and if it's not, then it goes back," she said. "The land doesn't owe anyone permanence. It just responds to what you do to it." Marcus wrote in his notebook. He wrote for longer than usual, and she let him finish without rushing him, because that was, she'd learned, how he needed to work with the space to get things down before they shifted into something else. When he closed the notebook, he said, "I want to do this. Not just learn about it, actually do it." "You're 13, she said. "Almost 14. Almost Fort Greed. You've got time. But I want you to know that that's what I want," he said. "So you know, for whatever that's worth." She looked at him. The serious face. The notebook. The way he stood in a pasture, like someone checking whether the ground felt right under his feet. "It's worth something," she told him. "Come back in spring." He nodded, satisfied with that, and they went back to checking the water levels in the last light of a summer that had been, by every measure that mattered, the best year Windscar Ranch had yet seen. The prairie held, and the herd grew, and the notebooks filled. The land continued doing what it had always been capable of doing when something treated it right. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but truly, and in the direction that mattered, and with more people watching and learning and carrying it forward than Orson Rourke had ever managed to convince in his lifetime. That was enough. For now, it was enough. The 4th year began with a death and ended with something took Tamsin a long time to find the right word for. Nell died on a Tuesday morning in early March, in her own bed, in the room she'd slept in at Windscar for the past 3 years, since her own house had gotten too much to manage alone. She'd gone to sleep the night. The same way the night before she did everything, without ceremony, without complaint, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who considered lingering over things to be a form of self-indulgence. She'd told Tamsin at dinner that the Section 2 water line would need attention before the ground froze again, and that the coffee had been weak all week, and that she was tired. She didn't wake up. The county coroner said her heart had simply stopped, which was the least surprising thing that could have been said about a 79-year-old woman who had been slowing by degrees since November. Tamsin had known it was coming the way you know. Weather is coming. The signs are there if you're paying attention, and you try not to pay too much attention, because knowing and accepting are different processes on different schedules. She called Eli first, then the cousins who needed to be called. Most of its windows were dark. Then she sat at the kitchen table for a long time with a cup of coffee she didn't drink, looking at the stack of Ortsot notebooks and the stack of her own notebooks next to them, and the blank space on the table where Nell's coffee cup had sat every morning for 3 years. Eli drove over that afternoon. He didn't say much when he arrived, which was right. He checked the Section 2 water line that Nell had mentioned, fixed the fitting that had been seeping, came back inside and made coffee that was stronger than Tamsin usually made it, and sat across from her at the table. After a while he said, "She knew what she was doing, you know. Coming here. What do you mean?" She could have stayed in her own house longer. She chose to come here. He wrapped both hands around his mug. She wanted to see how it ended up. Tamsin thought about that. About Nell standing at the gate the night the Bison came home, watching them find their footing on new ground. About Nell walking the damaged section with the toe of her boot turning over soil. About Nell handing over an envelope of money with a one-sentence instruction not to waste it. Did she tell you that? Tamsin asked. She told me that Orson spent 40 years building something nobody listened to, and she wasn't going to miss finding out whether you could make it work. He paused. She said she owed him that. Tamsin was quiet for a moment. She never said that to me. She wouldn't, Eli said. That's not how she talked to you. It was true. The way Nell talked to Tamsin was the way you talked to someone you were counting on, practically, specifically, with the implicit assumption that sentiment didn't need stating, because the work itself was the statement. She buried Nell beside Orson on the windy hill above the East Ridge, in the place where the view opened up over the best sections of Windscar, and you could see, on a clear day, all the way to the county road. The grave was simple. The marker said what it needed to say and nothing extra, because that was what Nell would have wanted, and also because Tamsin found, standing there in the March cold with the prairie wind, doing what prairie wind always did, that the extra words didn't come. She stood there for a long time after Eli and the few others who'd come had walked back down the hill. The herd was in Section 3 below her, moving through the late winter grass. 34 animals now, dark shapes against the pale ground, moving with the unhurried collective intelligence she'd spent 3 years learning to read. The bull was at the front of the group. He was 4 years old now, heavy and settled, nothing left of the auction pen animal who had stood halfway up a loading ramp, deciding whether this whole situation was worth his time. She thought about what Nell had said to her in the first days, looking at those thin, sorry animals in the near pasture. Those are very thin animals, Tamsin. I know. You spent most of what you had. I know that too. And then Nell had watched the youngest animal working through the ridge grass and had said, not quite to anyone, Orson said the cattle wouldn't touch that grass. That had been her version of blessing the whole enterprise. Tamsin understood that now in a way she hadn't quite grasped at the time. She turned and walked back down the hill. Spring came, and with it Marcus Vane as promised. He was 14 now, and 3 inches taller than the fall, which is what 14 does, and he had filled the spiral notebook and started a second one. He showed up its windows were dark. He showed up the first Saturday in April with his backpack and his notebooks and a question he'd apparently been holding since winter. I've been reading about soil carbon sequestration, he said, before she'd finished saying good morning, and I think what you're doing here might be doing it like actively increasing the soil carbon, but I don't know how to measure that. She looked at him for a moment. Good morning, Marcus. Good morning. But do you know how to measure it? I know some of it. Eli knows more. He's been talking to his rangeland ecology professor about it. She handed him a mug of coffee, which he'd started drinking in the fall with the solemnity of someone marking a transition. We were going to do baseline samples this spring. You can be part of that. His expression did the thing it did when he was trying not to look as pleased as he was. She'd thought, in the winter, about whether Nell's death would make having Marcus around harder, some daily reminder of continuity and teaching that would carry the wrong weight. It didn't work that way. If anything, Marcus' presence in the spring felt like a continuation of something rather than a reminder of what was gone. He asked the same quality of questions that Nell had always cut to the center of, with the same refusal to accept easy answers, and he did it with a teenager's particular combination of intensity and incomplete information that meant every conversation had rough edges and required actual thought. She needed that. She hadn't known how much she needed it until it was there. Eli came back in May, a week after his last final. These dark. He was enrolled in the rangeland ecology program and had finished his first year with results that his professors had apparently found noteworthy, which he reported with the same absence of drama that he brought to everything, and which Tamsin's received with the same. He was different in small ways. More technical in some of his language, the vocabulary of a field of studies sitting alongside the practical knowledge he'd built at Windscar, not replacing it but adding precision to it. He'd been working with data sets and literature that gave context to things they'd been observing empirically for 3 years, and he came back with a kind of excitement that was mostly contained, but occasionally surfaced in conversations that ran past midnight, with coffee going cold, and both of them bent over section maps and soil survey data. The first thing he did when he got back was walk all 7 sections alone, without telling her he was doing it, and come back with a notebook full of observations. Section 6, he said that evening. What about it? It's outperforming my projections. Based on where it was 3 years ago and the recovery timeline for that soil type, it should still be in mid-recovery. It's not. He spread his notes on the table. The root density is significantly higher than expected. And the species diversity Tamsin, there are species in there I didn't think would establish this quickly without direct seeding. She'd noticed it herself, but hadn't had the framework to quantify it. What does it mean? It means the bison interaction is doing something to the seed bank that we don't fully understand. The disturbance and rest cycle isn't just allowing recovery, it's accelerating it beyond what the literature predicts for passive restoration. He looked up at her. This is something that should be documented properly. Like, by people with instruments and a protocol. Emmett's daughter, she said. Exactly who I was thinking. Cora Cross had finished her graduate program in environmental science in December and had been looking, Emmett had mentioned, for a field site that matched her research interests. Tamsin called Emmett the next morning. By the end of the week, she'd had a conversation with Cora that went 2 hours and covered ground she hadn't expected: soil ecology, grazing history, the particular characteristics of this region's native plant communities, and the complete contents of 3 of Orson's notebooks that Tamsin read sections of over the phone, while Cora made sounds of increasing interest on the other end. Cora came out in June with equipment and a research protocol and an assistant, and spent 2 weeks establishing the baseline measurements that Eli had suggested. She was precise and methodical, and completely unbothered by the practical demands of working on an active ranch, which Tamsin had been slightly worried about, and needn't have been. She moved the equipment out of the way when the herd needed to be moved. She asked questions about the management decisions that were genuine scientific curiosity rather than criticism. She and Eli developed, within 48 hours of meeting, the specific shorthand of 2 people who are interested in the same things at the same technical level, which meant their conversations became largely incomprehensible to everyone else, but were obviously productive. On the last day of Cora's visit, she sat at the kitchen table with Tamsin and said what she'd apparently been assembling her thoughts to say all week. What you're doing here is not typical, she said. The recovery rates, the species response, the soil structure, it's ahead of what restoration projects with significantly more resources and direct intervention are achieving. She paused. I want to propose a formal research partnership. Monitoring protocol, data collection, published findings. No interference with your management decisions. Just documenting what's actually happening. What would that involve for me? Quarterly site visits. You providing access and your management records. Some of your time for interviews. And probably eventually some uncomfortable attention from people outside this county who find the results interesting. Tamsin thought about that last part. What kind of attention? The useful kind and the annoying kind, Cora said. Probably in equal measure. Tamsin was quiet for a moment. She thought about Orson writing in Notebook 12, filling margins sideways when he ran out of room. 40 years of data that nobody had formally documented. 40 years of a man watching something and understanding it and not being able to make anyone listen. Yes, she said. Let's document it. The summer Roy Tenner tried again was the summer Tamsin finally understood the difference between opposition and irrelevance. The second attempt was more sophisticated than the first, not a direct ordinance this time, but a proposal through the County Planning Commission for a zoning review of agricultural operations, involving non-domestic livestock, framed around ecosystem impact assessment requirements. It was dressed in the language of environmental stewardship, which was either ironic or strategic depending on how much credit you gave Roy Tenner for self-awareness. She found out about it the same way she'd found out about the first attempt through the Briar Hollow Information Network that had only gotten more reliable as the years passed. She sat with it for 2 days, reading the proposal language and thinking about what it would actually require if it passed. Then she called Cora. The research partnership, she said. How quickly can you get preliminary findings documented? Formally, 6 months minimum. Informally, something I could present to a county planning commission. A pause, 3 weeks if I work weekends. Work weekends, Tamsin said. She also called Dale Pruitt, Harlan Creed, Emmett Cross, and 2 other ranchers whose operations had been affected in some measurable way by what Windscar had been doing over the past 4 years. She didn't ask them to oppose the zoning review on her behalf. She asked them a specific question. In the drought year, what would your operation have lost if grazing sections hadn't been available? She got the numbers in writing. The Planning Commission meeting was on a Wednesday in August. She went alone this time, not because she lacked support, but because she decided that showing up with a coalition every time someone challenged her was a way of suggesting she needed one. What she brought instead was Cora's preliminary data, her own 4 years of section records, the written statements from 5 ranchers, and 43 of Orson's notebooks in a box that she set on the table in front of her when she sat down. She didn't refer to the notebooks during her presentation. She didn't need to. The box sat there and did its own work. She presented the data. She presented the economic record of the drought year. She presented the research partnership documentation. She was specific and methodical and answered every question the commission asked with information rather than argument. Roy Tenner spoke. He was measured and procedural and entirely avoided looking at the box of notebooks. Commission voted to table the zoning review pending further analysis, which in Planning Commission language meant it was going to sit in a drawer until everyone involved found other things to worry about. Afterward, walking to her truck in the August heat, Tamsin felt something she hadn't expected, not relief. Something flatter and more settled than relief. The kind of feeling that comes when you've passed a point and you know you're not going to have to pass it again in the same way. She drove home and called Eli, who's in the middle of his second year, and had been following the situation from a distance with the barely contained frustration of someone who wanted to be there and couldn't. "How'd it go?" he asked immediately. "Tabled a beat." "Tabled like it's done," she said. She heard him breathe out. "Then Roy Tenner is going to be insufferable at the next county board meeting. Probably. You okay with that?" Roy Tenner being insufferable at county board meetings is the price of operating in a county with county board meetings, she said. "I can afford it." Eli laughed, a short, real laugh, the kind he didn't produce often. "You're different than you were. 4 years will do that." "No," he said. "Not just 4 years, you specifically." He paused. "You're less you used to carry everything like it was going to fall if you put it down for a second. You're not doing that anymore." She thought about that, about the $63, about the fence post, about the auction and Garrick's voice and 19 thin animals making decisions without consulting her. "I learned to trust the land more than my own anxiety," she said. "The land doesn't panic. I try to follow its lead." "Orson wrote something like that," Eli said, "in Notebook 34. "I know," she said. "I wrote it down too. The 5th year was the year things compounded, not dramatically, not in any single event that made it clear before and after, but in the way that things compound when the foundation has been built correctly, quietly, in multiple directions, faster than you expected, once the conditions were finally right." The herd reached 51 animals. She'd been careful and deliberate about the growth, turning down the instinct to push faster when the financial case for more animals was clear, and the ecological case was not quite there yet. When Section 6 finished its recovery arc and the soil data from Cora's baseline measurements confirmed what Tamsin had been observing with her own eyes, deeper roots, higher water retention, species diversity that exceeded the pre-degradation estimates from county land records, she expanded the rotation to accommodate a larger herd. 51 animals on 4,000 acres of prairie that was measurably, documentably healthier than it had been 6 years ago. The most of its windows, something Silas Fenwick and Corbin Hale competed for, in the quiet, professional way of people who don't want to appear competitive, which was the best possible market position to be in. She still limited sales to what the herd could sustainably provide. Price per pound had increased 4 times since her first sale. The waiting list for product was longer than she could realistically fill in the next 2 years. She hired a part-time ranch hand in the spring, a woman named Daria who was 43, and had left a livestock operation in another county under circumstances she was brief about, and Tamsin didn't push on. Daria learned the rotation system in 3 weeks and the section management in 2 months, and had by mids and summer developed an accurate intuition for when the herd needed to be moved that Tamsin trusted as much as her own. Having another person, whose judgment she trusted, was something she hadn't realized she'd been missing until it was there. The loneliness of the first 2 years, the specific loneliness of making every decision alone and being wrong about some of them and having no one to think out loud with, except a teenager and an elderly woman that hadn't gone away entirely. But it had shifted into something more manageable. Something that felt less like isolation and more like the natural solitude of a person who had chosen a particular kind of life and was at peace with what that choice cost. 26. She'd been told, at various points, and by various people with various amounts of kindness, that this was young to be running a ranch alone. She'd come to understand that alone was not quite the right word for her situation and never had been. She had Eli and Daria and Marcus and Cora and Dale and Harlan and Emmett and the memory of Nell and the 43 notebooks of a man who had been waiting, in some sense, for exactly this. She was not alone. She was the center of something. That was different. Garrick Vane came back to Windscar in October of the 5th year, and this time he didn't call ahead. She was in Section 5 doing a routine check when she heard his truck on the drive. By the time she walked back, he was standing at the main gate, looking at the herd in Section 351 animals now, the bull magnificent in a way that was almost aggressive, the calves of this year's spring crop moving through the native grass with the sure-footedness of animals that had never known uncertain ground. She opened the gate, and he came in and they stood side by side at the section fence the way they'd stood 18 months ago. But it felt different now. Less weighted, less like a reckoning, and more like two people who had settled into a working understanding of what the other one was. Marcus showed me the soil data, Garrick said. The preliminary findings from the research study. Cora's work, he said the recovery rates are ahead of projections. He looked at the herd. He was excited about it in the way he gets excited. Tried to explain the soil carbon sequestration to me for about 20 minutes. Did you follow it? Some of it. A pause. More than I would have 2 years ago. He was quiet for a moment. He wants to study this. Formally. He's talking about the same program your young man Eli is in. He'd be good at it. I told him he should talk to you about whether that's the right direction. He looked at her sidelong. He said you'd already told him to come back every spring and keep learning. Took that as encouragement. He was right to, she said. Garrick was quiet again. He had the quality she'd noticed over the years of a man who had learned to be more comfortable with silence than he used to be. The drought had done some of that. The years of watching what Windscar had built while his own operations struggled to rebuild had done more. I want to propose something, he said, and I want you to hear it as a business proposal, not as anything else. Not as me trying to manage something or position myself. Just a business proposal. Go ahead. I've got 3 sections on my north property that have been underperforming for 15 years. Soil's depleted, grass is poor, carrying capacity is down 40% from what it should be. He paused. I want to start a restoration program on those sections. Native grass, rotational management. Not bison, I'm not in a position for that yet, maybe ever. But the principles you've been using, he looked at her. I want to hire you to consult on it. Proper consultation, proper rate, formal agreement. She considered this. Why not use the extension office? They have restoration programs. Because the extension office will tell me what the research says in general. I want someone who knows what works on this specific ground in this specific county. He paused. You've been modifying Orson's methods based on what you've actually observed here for 6 years. That's not something you can get from a government pamphlet. She almost smiled. No, she said, it isn't. Will you think about it? I don't need to think about it. She said, yes. I'll consult. Under 3 conditions. He waited. The conditions I set for the management plan are non-negotiable. If I say the section needs rest, it rests. If I say the stocking rate has to drop, it drops. You don't override my assessment with your financial pressure. Agreed. Second, Marcus works those sections when he's here. He needs field experience in active restoration work, not just established systems. Garrick nodded. He'll want to third. She paused. You tell people where the approach comes from. Not from me, from Orson. When people ask why you're doing it this way, you say Orson Rourke figured this out 40 years ago, and his granddaughter proved it worked. You don't let it become your innovation. Garrick was quiet for a long time. He deserved better than he got from this county, Tamsin said. Not accusing, just stating. He did, Garrick said. Yes, I'll say where it comes from. They shook hands at the section fence, and she walked him back to his truck. And when he left, she stood in the late October light, thinking about a man she'd never gotten to see succeed at the thing he'd spent his life understanding, and about how unfair that was, and about the fact that unfairness didn't cancel the work, and the work was what remained. Eli came home for the winter break in December, and they sat at the kitchen table the way they always had, with coffee and notebooks and the maps that had accumulated over years into a kind of documentary record of the whole project. He was 20 years old now. He'd grown into himself in the way that happens at that age, when the right environment meets the right inclination, more settled in his manner. Still serious, but with the seriousness softened by the confidence of someone who had started to understand where they belonged. His professors, according to what he reported with characteristic understatement, were interested in his field observations from Windscar. He'd been asked to present at a regional conference in the spring. "You should do it," she said. "I was going to. I wanted to make sure you were okay with the data being presented publicly. It's your research. It's your land." "The research is yours," she said. "You've been building it for 4 years. Present it." He nodded. Then, after a moment, "I've been thinking about after graduation." "You have 2 years left." "I know. But I've been thinking about it anyway." He looked at the section map on the wall. "There's something happening here that's bigger than one ranch. Principles the rotational approach, the native species restoration, the connection between grazing management and soil health at works here, because you understood the specific ground. But there are properties all over this region with similar soil types, similar degradation, similar native plant communities that could potentially—" "You want to scale it," she said. "I want to understand how to scale it without destroying what makes it work." He looked at her, which I think is the most important question, because most things that get scaled get ruined in the process. She thought about Corbin Hale asking for more animals than the land could support, about Harlan's 120 cattle and the answer being 60, about every decision she'd made over 5 years that had been at its core a decision to not take more than what was sustainable. "That is the most important question," she said. "So I need to figure it out before I start trying to answer," he said, "which means I need more time here, more data, more seasons of observation." He paused. "I think I need to come back after graduation. Not permanently, maybe, but for long enough to build the research properly." "I told you there'd be room for that conversation," she said. "I remember. The conversation is still open." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. Then, with the precision of someone who had been deciding whether to say a thing for a while, she would have liked seeing this. "Nell, where it is now." "I know," Tamsin said. "She told me once, about 6 months before she died, that she'd been wrong about you." Tamsin looked at him. "What do you mean?" She said, "When you bought the Bison, she thought you were doing something because Orson would have wanted it, honoring him. But she was wrong you were doing it because you understood why he was right. And that was a different thing." He set his cup down. She said understanding was rarer than loyalty. Tamsin was quiet for a long time. Kitchen had the winter quiet of a house well insulated against the cold outside, and the lamp cast the specific warm light that lamps cast in old farm kitchens in December, and the stack of notebooks at the end of the table was larger than it used to be, because her own notebooks had accumulated to 12 now alongside Orson's 43. "She never said that to me," Tamsin said finally. "No, she said it to me." He looked at his hands around the coffee cup. "I think she said it to me so it would get back to you eventually, in the right way." Tamsin thought about that, about the way Nell communicated affection sideways, practical instruction, and the passing of information to third parties, and the leaving of envelopes on breakfast tables. It was so completely consistent with every other thing Nell had ever done that it made her chest ache in the particular way grief operates when it's been living in you long enough to know your shape. "It was right," Tamsin said. "About the difference." "I know," Eli said. That's why she was Nell. The following spring, on a morning when the Section 3 bluestem was showing the early growth that came earlier every year, now, Tamsin drove to the hill above the east ridge and sat for a while between the two markers. She did this periodically, not on any schedule, just when she needed to think in a place that had the right kind of quiet. She'd brought Notebook 44 with her, the first blank one, after Orson's 43, the first page of her own continuing of what he'd started. She'd been writing in her own notebooks for 5 years. But this one felt different. This one was the one she'd designated as the record, the one that would sit with his, that someone else would someday read the way she'd read his. She opened it and looked at what she'd written on the first page 6 months ago, the night after she'd read Orson's last entry. She'd written one line, "Good land does not need to be conquered. It needs to be understood." She'd been sitting with that line since she wrote it, turning it over the way you turn over something that feels true but not complete. She picked up her pen now and wrote beneath it, in the handwriting that was her own, and no one else's, the same is true of people. She looked at what she'd written. It was simple, and possibly too simple, and she'd probably cross it out later. But it was if its windows were dark, but it was what she actually thought. And the notebooks had always been the place where she wrote what she actually thought. She looked out over the sections from the hill. The rotation was in section 2 today. She could see the herd from here. The dark shapes moving through the morning grass. 51 animals. 4th spring. The calves from this year were 3 weeks old, still close to their mothers, still finding their footing on ground that was, every year, a little more what it was supposed to be. The county road was visible from the hill, and as she watched, a truck slowed at the east boundary fence, not stopping, just slowing the way trucks had been doing for 2 years now. It was common enough that she'd stopped noting individual instances. People came to look. They talked. They went home and thought about their own sections and their own soil and their own depleted grass, and sometimes they called her, and sometimes they called the extension office, and sometimes they called Cora or Eli, and sometimes they just sat with it for a season and came back. That was fine. You couldn't rush understanding. She knew that better than anyone. She sat on the hill for another half hour, watching the herd and the road and the wide, flat light of a spring morning in that part of the country where the sky is larger than anywhere else. And the land is old enough that you can feel it under your feet, if you're willing to slow down long enough to try. Then she went back down the hill and went to work. Most of it's the county Briar Hollow learned over 6 years that no single event taught it. The drought wasn't the teacher, and Tamsin wasn't the teacher, and the bison weren't the teacher. The teacher was the accumulation of time and evidence and the slow erosion of the certainty that the way things had always been done was the way they had to be done. Harlan Creed rebuilt his operation in 3 years and did it differently than he'd done it before. Not bison, he kept cattle, because cattle were what he knew, but with rotational management that drew us in the same principles, using rest periods, he'd have called wasteful before the drought, and now understood as the difference between land that could sustain a dry year and land that couldn't. Dale Pruitt's daughter, who'd been studying environmental science at her university and had come home twice to work with Cora on the WinScar research project, joined the county extension office after graduation and spent her first year developing a native grass restoration guide that drew on 5 years of data from WinScar and 4 neighboring properties. She credited Orson Rourke on the first page, which was Tamsin's only condition for providing the data. Emmett Cross leased 2 sections of a neighboring failed property and began a restoration project. It was going slower than WinScar's had. The soil was in worse condition, and the financial pressure was higher, and Emmett didn't have Orson's 43 years of observations to start from. But he was a patient man who had learned something about patience from watching what happened when patience was applied correctly, and the sections were responding. Marcus Vane turned 16 in the year, the herd reached 51, and he spent the entire summer at WinScar working full days the way Eli had worked full days. Learning the same way Eli had learned, not from instruction so much as from sustained and serious attention to what was actually happening in front of him. He was applying to the rangeland ecology program for the following year. At the end of the summer, on his last day before school started, he was doing a water check in Section 6, the section that had performed beyond projections, the one that still surprised Cora when she ran her quarterly measurements, and he stopped in the middle of the section and looked at the ground for a long time. Tamsin was working the north fence line 50 yards away and could see him but not hear him. She watched him crouch down and look at something close to the surface, the way she'd crouched down in that same section 4 years ago, looking at seedlings she hadn't been sure would take. He stood up and came over. There are 4 species in that quadrant that weren't in the baseline survey, he said. I just identified them from the field guide. They're in the county native plant record, but weren't in this section in the historical data. She looked back at the spot where he'd been crouching. Are you sure? He handed her the field guide, open to the relevant pages, with the plant photos beside his notes. He documented the location with a hand-drawn sketch that was more precise than most adults produced. She looked at it. He was right. She looked at the section around them, the density of the native grass, the variety of it, the particular healthy green of plants with deep roots in rebuilt soil, and she thought about Orson walking this ground 40 years ago, counting species, writing in his notebooks, watching what the cattle were doing, and what the land was losing. She thought about what he would say standing here now. She thought he would not say anything for a long time, and then he would write it down. Document it, she said. Exact location, count, condition. Put it in the research record. Marcus was already writing. She watched him and felt something that didn't fit neatly into a single word. Not pride, or not only pride, something larger than that, and less personal. Feeling of watching something continue, past the point where you started it. The feeling of a notebook being added to by someone else's hand. She went back to the fence line and got back to work. 6 years after walking into a livestock auction with $4,000 and some dollars and a sentence from a dead man's notebook, Tamsin Rourke stood at the loading fence watching a portion of the herd move between sections in the late afternoon of an October that had turned the ridge grass gold. 91 animals now, not yet 100. She'd been holding the growth at the pace the land told her was right. And the land, that year, had said yes to 91. She was 28 years old. She was heavier than she'd been at the auction, which six years of ranch work will do in both directions, and which she thought about considerably less than she once had. She wore her grandfather's canvas coat in the cold months, the same one she'd grabbed off the hook the morning of the road incident. In year 1, the elbows worn through now, and one pocket repaired twice. The county didn't laugh at her anymore. That wasn't quite right. Either the county had simply recalibrated in the way communities recalibrate when evidence accumulates past the point where a comfortable dismissal is possible. Some people had come to genuine understanding, others had come to a pragmatic respect that coexisted with opinions they hadn't fully revised. Few Roy Tenner among them maintained a distance that was its own form of acknowledgement. She didn't need them to have changed completely. She'd never needed that. What she needed she had built. What she'd promised to the land, to Orson, to herself in the kitchen with $63, and 19 thin animals outside she had kept. Doria came up beside her at the fence, Cora called. She wants to schedule the fall measurements for next week. Tell her Tuesday works. Marcus left his field guide in section 3. He does that. It'll still be there. Daria leaned on the fence rail. She developed the habit of Tammin's patience in the way that people absorb the working habits of people they spend enough time with. You count them? She asked, nodding at the herd. 91, Tamsin said. From 19. Daria was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do when you get to 100? Tamsin looked at the herd. At the bull, the original bull, 7 years old now, gray coming in around his muzzle, moving through the late grass with the settled authority of an animal that had earned his place in this landscape one winter at a time. Keep going, she said, carefully. She stayed at the fence until the light changed and the shadows came long across the sections and the herd settled into the stillness of late afternoon. Then she walked back toward the house, past the barn that still had the lean in it that Nell had predicted would cause problems and that had not yet fallen, past the windmill in section 3 that ran quietly in the October wind, past the flat rock at the edge of section 3, where she'd eaten a sandwich in the first year and stared at a gap in the wire and felt the weight of everything she didn't know yet. The house was warm, and the lamp was on, and 43 notebooks sat at the end of the kitchen table, 12 of her own. On the wall, the section map had been updated so many times, the original ink was buried under layers of revision. On the table, notebook 44 was open to the page she'd been working on. She sat down, poured coffee, picked up her pen. She wrote what she'd seen that day. The 91 animals, the late grass, the 4 species Marcus had documented in section 6, the way the land looked in October when it had been allowed to be what it was. She wrote it plainly, without trying to make it sound like more than it was, because what it actually was had turned out to be enough. More than enough. She wrote until the lamp was the only light, and outside the prairie was dark and quiet and alive, in the way it was every night out there on the 4,000 acres of ground that everyone had agreed was worthless, and which had turned out to contain everything.